I've always loved the idea of camping, a break from the noise, the rush, and the suffocating demands of everyday life. Nature offers a rare kind of silence, the kind where you can hear yourself think. I'd been planning this solo camping trip for months, scouring forums for the perfect spot and settling on a remote location in a national forest. It was supposed to be an escape, a chance to reset my mind. I had no idea it would turn into the most terrifying experience of my life. I chose a site far from the usual campgrounds, deep into the woods where I knew I wouldn't run into other campers. Solitude was the goal. After parking my car at the trailhead, I loaded up my backpack with all the essentials. Tent, sleeping bag, enough food and water for a few days, a first aid kit, and a good knife just in case. The hike to my chosen spot took about 4 hours, weaving through dense forest and climbing rocky inclines. By the time I reached a small clearing surrounded by towering pine trees, my legs were burning, and my shirt clung to my back with sweat. The view was worth it. The trees framed a small stream that glistened in the afternoon sun, and I felt an overwhelming sense of peace. I set up camp quickly. The tent went up in the flattest part of the clearing, and I gathered stones to create a fire pit a safe distance away. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the forest floor, I had a small fire crackling and a cup of instant noodles steaming in my hands. The silence of the woods wasn't unnerving yet. It felt calming, like a blanket wrapping me in quiet. I sat by the fire until the stars came out. The sky above me a vast, unbroken stretch of black dotted with pinpricks of light. It was beautiful. I turned in for the night, tired but content. The first night passed without incident. I woke to the soft light of dawn filtering through the tent walls and the distant sound of birds calling to one another. After a quick breakfast of granola bars and coffee from a portable press, I spent the day exploring the area. I followed the stream upstream, found a small waterfall, and even spotted a deer grazing in a sunlit patch of grass. The hours slipped by, and before I knew it, the sun was setting again. Back at camp, I lit another fire and cooked some dehydrated chili. It was another peaceful evening, or so I thought. The first sign that something was off came that night. I woke up suddenly, heart pounding, with no idea what had startled me. The tent was pitch black, the kind of dark where you can't even see your hand in front of your face. I lay still, straining to hear anything over the sound of my own breathing. At first, there was nothing, just the usual night sounds of the forest. But then I heard it, a faint rustling, like something moving through the underbrush. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. My mind raced. Could have been an animal, a raccoon, maybe, or a deer. But something about the sound felt deliberate, like it was too slow, too calculated to be random. I told myself I was being paranoid, that the isolation was playing tricks on my mind. Still, I clutched my knife and lay awake for hours, ears straining for every sound, until exhaustion finally pulled me under. The next morning, I found nothing unusual around my campsite. No tracks, no disturbed vegetation, nothing to suggest that anything or anyone had been nearby. I convinced myself it had been a small animal and tried to shake off the lingering unease. I spent the day fishing at the stream, catching a few small trout that I cooked over the fire that evening. As the sun dipped below the horizon, though, the unease crept back in. The forest seemed different, quieter, like it was holding its breath. That night, the noises started again. This time, they were louder. I woke to the sound of twigs snapping, followed by heavy footsteps. Not the light, quick steps of a deer, but the deliberate, measured steps of something or someone. My heart hammered in my chest as I lay frozen, every muscle tense. The footsteps circled the tent, slow and methodical, crunching the dry leaves and twigs that littered the forest floor. I didn't dare move. I held my breath, praying that whoever or whatever it was would just leave. Eventually, The footsteps faded, swallowed by the forest. I lay awake until dawn, clutching my knife and flinching at every sound. When daylight finally came, I emerged from the tent cautiously, scanning the area for any signs of what had been out there. Again, I found nothing, no footprints, no broken branches, no signs that anyone had been near. It didn't make sense. My unease deepened, but I told myself I was overreacting. I'd come out here for solitude, and now I was jumping at shadows. By the third night, I was on edge. I decided to keep the fire burning all night, hoping it would deter whatever was out there. I sat by the flames, knife in hand, staring into the darkness beyond the firelight. Hours passed, and I started to think that maybe I'd imagined it all. Maybe the isolation really was getting to me. But then I heard it again, the snapping of twigs, the deliberate footsteps. This time, they didn't circle the tent. They stopped just beyond the firelight, where the darkness swallowed everything. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel it, the oppressive weight of being watched. I didn't sleep that night. When the sun finally rose, I made the decision to pack up and leave. The trip was supposed to last another 2 days, but my nerves were shot. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that I was being followed. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could and started the hike back to the trailhead. The forest felt different now, menacing. Every sound made me jump. Every shadow felt like it was hiding something. About halfway back to the car, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The trail, which I'd followed meticulously on the way in, seemed different. Markers I remembered passing were gone, and the path felt unfamiliar. I stopped, pulling out my map and compass, trying to make sense of it. Somehow I was off course. Panic started to set in as I realized I might be lost. I tried to backtrack, but the more I walked, the more disoriented I became. The trees all looked the same, and the trail seemed to disappear beneath my feet. I stopped to catch my breath, forcing myself to stay calm. Panic wouldn't help me. I decided to follow the stream, reasoning that it would eventually lead me to a larger water source or a road. As I moved along the bank, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, but I never saw anything. The footsteps were gone, but the silence of the forest felt suffocating. It wasn't until late afternoon that I stumbled upon something that froze me in my tracks. In a small clearing by the stream, I found the remnants of a campsite. It wasn't mine. The tent was collapsed, torn and weathered, and the fire pit was cold and overgrown. Scattered around the site were personal items: a backpack, a pair of hiking boots, a water bottle. It looked like it had been abandoned for months. The sight sent a chill down my spine. Who had camped here? Why had they left in such a hurry? And why hadn't they come back for their gear? I didn't linger. The sun was starting to set, and I didn't want to be caught out in the open after dark. I picked up my pace, following the stream as best I could. My legs ached, and my throat was dry, but I pushed on, driven by a growing sense of urgency. As night fell, I finally spotted something that made my heart leap, a faint glimmer of light through the trees. I stumbled toward it, emerging onto a dirt road where a ranger's truck was parked. The ranger looked up in surprise as I approached, disheveled and out of breath. I must have looked half-crazed as I blurted out my story, but he listened patiently and offered me a ride back to my car. As we drove, he mentioned something that sent a final shiver down my spine. "You're lucky I was out here," he said. "This part of the forest hasn't been patrolled much lately. A lot of folks avoid it. There've been stories, people hearing things, getting lost, finding abandoned campsites. Some of them don't come back." I didn't respond. I didn't want to think about what might have happened if I hadn't found the road, if the ranger hadn't been there. All I knew was that I'd never camp alone again. The forest had lost its peace, its allure. Now it felt like a place where you could disappear, swallowed whole by the silence. It was the middle of October when I decided to head out for a solo camping trip. The leaves had turned to fiery shades of orange and red, and the crisp autumn air made everything feel alive. I'd been stressed at work for months, and I thought a weekend away in the woods would do me good. I packed my gear meticulously. Tent, sleeping bag, enough food for 3 days, a good knife, and my trusted map and compass. I'd picked a relatively remote spot in a national forest, a place where I knew I wouldn't run into many other people. I parked my car at the trailhead on Friday afternoon. The sun was already starting to sink lower in the sky, casting long shadows through the trees. I shouldered my backpack, locked up the car, and began my hike. The trail started out wide and well-maintained, but as I ventured deeper into the forest, it grew narrower and less defined. I felt a sense of freedom as the sounds of civilization faded away. No cars, no phones, just the rustling of leaves and the occasional chirp of a bird. About 4 miles in, I found the perfect spot to set up camp. It was a small clearing surrounded by towering pines, with a little stream running nearby. The ground was soft but not too damp, and there was enough flat space for my tent. I set up quickly, pitching the tent and rolling out my sleeping bag. Once everything was ready, I gathered some wood and built a small fire. Sitting by the flames as the sky turned dark, I felt a rare sense of peace. I ate a simple dinner of trail mix and jerky, then crawled into my tent for the night. I woke up once in the middle of the night, startled by a sound I couldn't immediately identify. It was a low, guttural noise, almost like a growl but not quite. My heart raced as I lay still, listening. After a few moments, it stopped, and the forest fell silent again. I told myself it was probably just some animal passing through, maybe a raccoon or a fox, and eventually drifted back to sleep. The next day, I decided to explore the area around my campsite. I left most of my gear behind, taking only my map, compass, and a small day pack with some water and snacks. The forest was dense, and it was easy to lose track of time as I wandered through the trees. I found an old, overgrown trail that didn't seem to be marked on my map. Curiosity got the better of me, and I followed it. After about an hour, the trail led me to a strange clearing. In the center stood what looked like the remnants of an old cabin. The wood was rotting, and the structure was barely standing. Vines and moss had taken over, and it was clear that no one had been here in a very long time. Still, there was something unsettling about it. The air felt heavier, and the usual sounds of the forest seemed muted. I didn't linger long. As I made my way back to camp, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I'd stop every now and then, listening intently, but all I heard were the usual rustlings of the forest. Still, the unease stayed with me, and I was relieved when I finally spotted my tent through the trees. I spent the rest of the day close to camp, collecting firewood and reading a book I'd brought along. By nightfall, I had almost convinced myself that my nerves were just playing tricks on me. That night, I woke up again. This time, it wasn't a sound that had disturbed me, but a feeling. It's hard to describe, but it was as if the air inside the tent had changed. I lay there in the dark, my ears straining for any noise. Then I heard it, the unmistakable crunch of footsteps on dry leaves. My stomach dropped. Someone, or something, was outside my tent. I reached for my knife, my hand trembling. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, circling the tent. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. I debated whether to call out or stay silent, but fear kept me frozen. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps stopped. I waited, knife in hand, for the rest of the night. I didn't sleep a wink. When dawn finally broke, I unzipped the tent cautiously and peered outside. There was no one there, but I noticed something that sent a chill down my spine. Around my campsite, in the soft dirt, were footprints. They were human, barefoot, and much larger than my own. Whoever it was had walked right up to my tent and then disappeared back into the forest. I decided then and there that my trip was over. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could, constantly glancing over my shoulder. The hike back to the car felt endless. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made my heart race. I felt exposed, vulnerable, as if I were being watched the entire way. When I finally reached the trailhead and saw my car, I nearly cried with relief. I threw my backpack into the trunk, started the engine, and didn't stop driving until I was miles away. Even now, weeks later, I can't stop thinking about those footprints. Who or what had been out there with me, and why had they come so close to my tent without making their presence known? I haven't been camping since. I planned a solo camping trip for weeks. It had been years since I took time for myself, and I craved solitude. The idea of being surrounded by nothing but trees, the sound of leaves rustling, and the occasional chirp of a bird seemed like the perfect way to disconnect from the daily grind. I chose a spot deep in a forest that was supposed to be serene and remote. It wasn't a marked campsite, but a location I found online where seasoned hikers had shared their experiences. It seemed perfect. I left my car in a small gravel parking lot at the trailhead. The air was crisp, and the sky was clear, promising good weather for the next couple of days. I hoisted my backpack, heavy with supplies, and set off down the trail. The forest swallowed me quickly. The towering trees cast long shadows, and the path narrowed with every step. It felt like entering a different world, one where time slowed and the concerns of the modern world faded. The hike to my chosen spot was about 6 miles. The trail was uneven, with roots snaking across the ground and occasional steep inclines. As I walked, I couldn't help but notice how quiet it was. Aside from the crunch of my boots on the dirt and the occasional rustle of leaves, it was eerily still. It felt peaceful at first, but as the hours passed, the silence started to feel heavy. I brushed it off, reminding myself that this was what I came for: solitude. I reached my destination in the late afternoon. It was a small clearing surrounded by tall pines. A shallow creek ran nearby, its gentle gurgle the only sound breaking the silence. I set down my pack and began to set up camp. My tent was a compact one-person setup, easy to assemble. I pitched it on a flat patch of ground, not too close to the creek but near enough for convenience. After unpacking my sleeping bag and securing my food in a bear canister, I gathered some firewood. As the sun dipped lower, the temperature dropped. I lit a small fire and cooked a simple meal. Sitting by the fire, I felt a sense of accomplishment. The glow of the flames cast dancing shadows on the trees, and the stars began to peek through the darkening sky. This was exactly what I had envisioned: peaceful, quiet, and far from everything. I stayed up for a while, watching the fire die down until it was just embers. Then, I crawled into my tent and zipped myself into my sleeping bag. The sounds of the creek lulled me to sleep. I woke up in the middle of the night. At first, I wasn't sure what had disturbed me. I lay still, listening. The forest was dark and silent, except for the occasional hoot of an owl. I convinced myself it was nothing, probably just the unfamiliar environment. Eventually, I drifted back to sleep. The next day, I explored the area around my campsite. I followed the creek upstream, marveling at how untouched everything looked. Fallen trees, moss-covered rocks, and patches of wildflowers made the landscape look like something out of a nature documentary. I found a spot where the creek widened into a small pool and stopped to rest. The water was icy cold and clear enough to see the smooth pebbles at the bottom. I spent a good part of the day there, enjoying the simplicity of it all. When I returned to my campsite, I noticed something odd. The fire pit I had made the previous night looked disturbed. The rocks were scattered, and there were smudges of ash on the ground. I frowned, trying to remember if I had left it that way, but I was certain I hadn't. It didn't look like an animal had done it. It seemed too deliberate. I shook off the unease that crept into my mind and rebuilt the fire pit, convincing myself it wasn't worth worrying about. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The stillness of the forest, which had felt peaceful before, now felt oppressive. I tried to focus on the comforting crackle of the fire and the warmth it provided, but my eyes kept darting to the shadows beyond the glow of the flames. Every rustle of leaves made my heart jump. I told myself it was just my imagination, the product of being alone in an unfamiliar place. Eventually, I forced myself into the tent and tried to sleep. I woke again in the middle of the night, this time to a sound. It was faint but distinct, the crunch of footsteps on the forest floor. My heart pounded as I strained to listen. The sound stopped, and the silence that followed was deafening. I lay there, paralyzed, for what felt like hours. I didn't dare move or make a sound. Eventually, exhaustion overtook me, and I fell asleep out of sheer fatigue. In the morning, I found more signs that something or someone had been near my campsite. A few small branches near the edge of the clearing had been snapped, and there were faint impressions in the dirt. Too vague to tell if they were footprints, but enough to unsettle me. My rational mind tried to come up with explanations. Maybe it was just a curious animal. Maybe I was overreacting, but a part of me couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I decided to cut my trip short. As much as I wanted to push through and enjoy the solitude, the unease had grown too strong to ignore. I packed up my gear and started the hike back to the trailhead. The forest, which had seemed so inviting on the way in, now felt menacing. Every shadow looked like it could be hiding something, and every sound made me jump. About halfway back, I came across something that made my blood run cold. A tree near the trail had a deep gash in its trunk, as if someone had taken a knife to it. The cut was fresh, the bark still oozing sap. Below it, on the ground, was a small pile of rocks stacked in a deliberate pyramid. It didn't feel like an accident. My heart raced as I scanned the area, but I saw no one. I quickened my pace, my mind racing with questions and fears. The final stretch of the hike felt endless. By the time I reached the parking lot, I was drenched in sweat despite the cool air. My car was the only vehicle there, just as I had left it. I threw my gear into the back seat and locked the doors as soon as I got inside. The relief of being behind the wheel was immense, but the lingering sense of unease stayed with me. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been watched the entire time I was in the forest. I don't know if it was just my imagination playing tricks on me or if someone had actually been out there. I've gone on many camping trips since then, but I've never returned to that spot. And I always choose well-populated campgrounds now. The solitude I had craved so much no longer feels worth the risk. It was supposed to be a relaxing weekend, a simple getaway to the woods. My friends and I had been planning this camping trip for months. We wanted to escape the everyday grind, to disconnect from the noise of city life. Little did I know that this trip would be anything but peaceful. We arrived at the campsite in the late afternoon, just as the sun was starting to dip below the treeline. The air was crisp, and the smell of pine and damp earth filled my lungs. There was something oddly soothing about it. The sound of the wind rustling through the trees, the occasional call of a bird in the distance. It felt like the kind of quiet I hadn't experienced in years. We set up camp near a small creek, a peaceful spot we thought would be perfect for a fire and some good stories under the stars. It wasn't too far from the trailhead, so we wouldn't have to worry about getting lost, and there weren't many other campers around. Just the kind of solitude we were looking for. The first few hours were perfect. We joked around as we built the fire, roasted marshmallows, and enjoyed the cool night. The crackling of the flames was comforting, and the dark forest around us seemed far away, as if we were in a bubble of warmth and light. But as the night wore on, something changed. It was subtle at first, just a feeling, like the forest had grown quieter, as if something was watching us. I brushed it off, chalking it up to the darkness and my imagination. We went to bed not long after, each of us retreating to our tents. I fell asleep quickly, but I woke up in the middle of the night, wide awake and unable to shake the feeling that something was wrong. My heart raced in the dark, and I lay there, staring at the inside of my tent. The forest was silent. There were no crickets, no wind, nothing. Just the eerie stillness that made every little noise stand out in sharp contrast. I shifted in my sleeping bag, trying to get comfortable again, but I couldn't. There was a strange sound coming from the forest. It was hard to place, but it sounded like footsteps. Slow, deliberate, moving through the brush. The kind of sound that makes you wonder if you're imagining it or if something is actually out there. I tried to convince myself it was an animal, a deer maybe, or a bear moving through the trees. But I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever it wasn't just an animal. It wasn't until I heard a faint crack of a branch nearby that I realized how close the sound was. I held my breath, straining to listen, but everything went quiet again. Too quiet. I laid there, frozen, for what felt like hours, listening for anything. The night stretched on, each second feeling like an eternity. Just when I thought I might drift off again, the footsteps came again. Closer this time. They were unmistakable, and they were not the sound of any animal I knew. The steps were too deliberate, too human. I sat up, heart pounding in my chest, and slowly unzipped the door of my tent. The night was pitch black, the only light coming from the embers of the dying campfire. I couldn't see anything out there, but I could hear the faint crunch of leaves and twigs, as if someone or something was moving around just beyond the light's reach. I didn't know what to do. My mind raced through all the possible explanations, trying to rationalize it. Maybe it was another camper who had gotten lost, or maybe it was just a hiker passing by. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. There was something off about it. I grabbed my flashlight and slowly stepped out of the tent, my hands shaking. The cold air hit me like a slap, and I could see my breath fog in the air. The forest around us seemed to swallow up all sound, as if it was holding its breath, too. I pointed the flashlight around, the beam cutting through the darkness. Nothing. The campsite was still. The fire pit was almost completely cold, with just a few glowing embers left. My friends were still asleep in their tents, unaware of the creeping dread that had settled in my chest. I paced back and forth, shining the light into the trees, scanning for any movement. But there was nothing, just the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind and the distant sound of the creek flowing. I was starting to convince myself that it was all in my head when I heard it again. Closer this time, the unmistakable sound of someone walking just behind the tree line. I froze, the flashlight trembling in my hand. My heart was pounding so hard, I thought it might burst. I could feel the blood rushing in my ears, drowning out all other sounds. I slowly backed toward the campfire, my eyes scanning the darkness, looking for any sign of movement. The sound stopped, and for a moment, everything was still again. My breath was shallow, my mind racing with fear and confusion. Then I saw something. Just beyond the trees, barely visible in the shadows, there was a figure. It was tall, and it was moving slowly, almost as if it was aware I was watching. The figure paused, and I could see it for just a second before it vanished back into the darkness. I blinked, unsure of what I had just seen. My mind tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just a trick of the light, or maybe it was an animal standing on two legs. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I rushed back to my tent, my pulse racing. I had to wake my friends. I couldn't do this alone. But as I reached the tent, I stopped. A cold chill ran through me as I realized something. The footsteps had stopped. The night was silent again, too silent. I stood there for a moment, my hand on the zipper of my tent, unsure of what to do. Should I wake my friends and tell them? Would they believe me? And if there was someone out there, what would happen? I had no idea. Then, a voice inside my head told me to get out of there, to leave. I wasn't about to wait around to find out what it was that was lurking in the woods. I unzipped the tent and grabbed my backpack, quietly packing up my things. I wasn't about to stay in that campsite a moment longer. The night felt suffocating, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for me just outside the light of the fire. I quietly woke my friends, telling them we had to leave immediately. They were groggy and confused, but I wasn't waiting for any more questions. I quickly packed up the rest of our gear and started toward the trailhead. My heart raced, and I could feel the weight of the silence pressing down on me. We made our way back down the trail, the sounds of the forest now seeming to close in around us. Every rustle, every snap of a twig had me jumping. I didn't stop to look back. We just kept walking, faster and faster, until we finally reached the car. Once inside, I locked the doors and started the engine, feeling a wave of relief wash over me as we pulled away from the campsite. The tension that had built up over the past few hours slowly started to fade, and I could breathe again. We drove in silence, none of us speaking a word. No one needed to ask what had happened. We all felt it. Something had been out there, something that didn't belong. By the time we reached a nearby town, the sun was beginning to rise, casting light on everything we had just been through. I felt a sense of calm wash over me, but there was a nagging feeling at the back of my mind, a question I couldn't shake. What had we really seen out there? In the end, we never went back to that campsite. We never spoke much about it after that night, and I don't think any of us were ever truly able to forget what happened. But we were safe, and as far as I'm concerned, that's the most important part of the story. Because sometimes, the best thing you can do when you're faced with the unknown is to leave it behind. Camping alone had always been my way of escaping the monotony of life. No emails, no phone calls, just me and the wilderness. That's exactly what I needed when I planned my trip to the remote forest in northern Vermont. I packed light but thoroughly. A small tent, sleeping bag, enough food and water for a few days, a flashlight, a multi-tool, and my trusty hiking boots. I wanted simplicity, nothing fancy, just nature and solitude. The trailhead was deserted when I arrived. The quiet was almost unsettling at first, but I reminded myself that this was the whole point. I checked the map one last time and started hiking. The path wound through towering pines and birches, their canopies filtering sunlight into dappled patches on the ground. The air smelled fresh, earthy, and clean, and the sound of birds chirping made the world feel alive. About 3 hours in, I reached a clearing where I decided to set up camp. The area was perfect. A flat patch of ground surrounded by trees with a small brook nearby for water. I pitched my tent, gathered some firewood, and set up a small campfire. As the sun began to set, the forest grew quieter, save for the occasional rustling of leaves in the breeze. That first night was uneventful. I sat by the fire, eating a simple meal of canned soup and crackers, and gazed at the stars. The darkness here was so complete it felt like I was wrapped in it. Around midnight, I crawled into my tent and fell asleep to the sounds of the brook gurgling nearby and the distant hoot of an owl. The next morning, I decided to explore the area around my camp. I took my map, marked the location of my tent, and headed deeper into the woods. The forest was dense, and the trails were faint and unmaintained. I made mental notes of landmarks to avoid getting lost. A fallen tree with moss covering one side, a cluster of boulders that looked like giant marbles, and a tree with a large scar from a lightning strike. Around midday, I stumbled upon something odd. In a small clearing, there was a ring of stones with charred wood inside. Someone had camped here recently. That in itself wasn't strange, but the campsite looked abandoned in a hurry. A couple of empty cans and a torn plastic tarp were scattered nearby. I didn't see any footprints or other signs of who might have been there. It made me uneasy, but I chalked it up to someone leaving in a rush and decided to move on. As the day wore on, I realized I'd wandered farther than I intended. The sun was beginning to dip toward the horizon, and I hadn't seen any of the landmarks I'd noted earlier. Panic started to bubble up, but I forced myself to stay calm. I had my map and compass, and I knew the general direction to head back. It took longer than expected, and by the time I made it back to my camp, it was almost dark. Relief washed over me when I saw the familiar shape of my tent. I started a fire and cooked some dinner, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling that had clung to me all afternoon. That night, I was woken by a sound. It was faint at first, like distant footsteps, but it grew louder. Something was moving outside my tent. My heart pounded as I grabbed my flashlight. I unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. The forest was pitch black except for the faint glow of my dying fire. I didn't see anything, but the sounds continued, slow, deliberate steps, circling my campsite. I stayed still, listening intently. Whatever it was, it didn't sound like an animal. Animals don't move like that, so steady and intentional. After what felt like hours but was likely just minutes, the footsteps faded into the distance. I lay awake the rest of the night, clutching my flashlight and multi-tool, jumping at every sound the forest made. The next morning, I found no evidence of anyone or anything near my camp. The ground was undisturbed, and there were no footprints or broken branches. I told myself it must have been an animal, though I didn't fully believe it. Still, I resolved to stay one more night before heading back to the trailhead the following morning. That day, I stuck close to camp, unwilling to risk getting lost again. I gathered more firewood, made a small meal, and tried to relax. The day passed uneventfully, but as the sun set, the dread began to creep back in. I made the fire larger than usual, hoping the light would keep anything or anyone away. That night, the footsteps returned. This time, they were louder, closer, and more erratic. It wasn't just circling. It sounded like whoever or whatever it was moving quickly, darting around the edges of my campsite. I shined my flashlight into the darkness, but the beam only revealed trees and shadows. I yelled, hoping to scare off whatever it was, but the sounds didn't stop. My voice echoed through the forest, swallowed by the night. Then a loud crack. It sounded like a branch snapping underfoot, just beyond the firelight. I jumped to my feet, clutching my multi-tool like it could actually protect me. My eyes scanned the darkness, and that's when I saw it. A figure just at the edge of the light. It was human-shaped, but I couldn't make out any details. It stood there for a moment before disappearing into the trees. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fire until dawn, every muscle in my body tense, listening for any sign of movement. As soon as there was enough light to see, I packed up my camp and started hiking back to the trailhead. My legs felt like lead, and every rustle of leaves made me jump. The forest, once serene, now felt oppressive, like it was watching me. The hike back took longer than expected. The trails seemed unfamiliar, and I had to backtrack several times. At one point, I found myself in a part of the forest I didn't recognize, despite following the map. Panic started to set in again, but I forced myself to stay calm. I retraced my steps until I found the main trail and eventually made it back to the trailhead by late afternoon. When I reached my car, I felt a wave of relief so strong I almost cried. I threw my gear into the back seat and drove away without looking back. As I left the forest behind, the tension in my body began to ease, but the questions lingered. Who or what had been out there with me? What did they want? I've told myself it was probably just another camper playing a prank or someone passing through. But deep down, I'm not sure. All I know is that I won't be camping alone again anytime soon. Camping in the wilderness was always something I enjoyed. Growing up, my family often spent summers in the forests of Vermont, so I had a strong connection to nature. As an adult, those trips became less frequent, but I still tried to carve out time each year to go camping alone. There's something about the solitude of being surrounded by trees, miles from anyone, that clears the mind. That's why, last October, I decided to spend a weekend in a remote national forest in Washington state. The drive to the trailhead took hours, winding through mountain roads and passing small, forgotten towns. I arrived late in the afternoon, parked my car, and hoisted my gear onto my back. The forest was dense, the kind of place where even during the day, sunlight struggled to break through the canopy. I had a map and a compass along with my GPS, though I'd learned not to rely too heavily on technology. Batteries die and signals can fail. My plan was to hike about 8 miles to a secluded spot near a stream where I'd set up camp. The hike started off uneventfully. The forest was alive with the sound of birds and the occasional rustle of leaves as squirrels darted about. I followed a well-marked trail for the first couple of miles before branching off onto a less trodden path. The air was crisp, the kind that bites your skin but feels refreshing at the same time. I breathed deeply, enjoying the earthy scent of moss and decaying leaves. By the time I reached my planned campsite, the sun was dipping below the horizon. I quickly set up my tent, gathered some wood for a small fire, and prepared a simple meal. As I sat by the fire, eating, I felt at peace. The stars above were bright, uninhibited by city lights. The stream nearby provided a soothing background noise, its gentle gurgling blending with the occasional hoot of an owl. The first night passed without incident. I woke up early, the morning air chilly and damp. After breakfast, I decided to explore the area. I left my heavy gear at the campsite, taking only a day pack with water, snacks, and my map. My goal was to follow the stream upstream for a while to see if I could find any interesting spots. The terrain was rough, with fallen logs and dense underbrush making progress slow. The stream's path wound through a narrow valley, the bank steep and lined with thick vegetation. After about an hour of hiking, I came across a clearing. It was an odd place, the kind of spot that makes you pause. The ground was bare, as if nothing had ever grown there, and large rocks were scattered around as though they'd been deliberately placed. There was no sign of human activity, no fire pits, no trash, nothing to suggest someone had been there. Yet, the arrangement of the rocks felt unnatural. I lingered for a moment, taking in the scene, before deciding to move on. The air felt heavier there, as if the atmosphere itself was pressing down on me. Shaking off the unease, I continued upstream, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every so often, I'd stop and look around, but there was never anything to see, just the trees and the stream. Eventually, I turned back, retracing my steps to the campsite. By the time I got back, it was late afternoon, and I was tired. I spent the rest of the day resting, collecting more firewood, and preparing my dinner. That night, as I lay in my tent, the forest felt different. The usual sounds of wildlife were absent. No crickets, no owls, nothing. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional crack of a branch in the distance. I told myself it was just a deer or some other animal, but my nerves were on edge. Every sound seemed magnified, and sleep came fitfully. The next morning, I decided to pack up and move to a different spot. The unease from the previous day still lingered, and I thought a change of scenery might help. I studied my map and chose a location about 4 miles away, deeper into the forest. It was more remote with no marked trails leading to it, but that was part of the appeal. The hike was tough. Without a clear trail, I had to rely on my compass and navigate through dense underbrush. The forest here was darker, the trees older and taller, their thick branches blocking out much of the light. By the time I reached the new spot, I was exhausted. I set up camp near a small clearing, not far from another stream. The area felt more open, less claustrophobic than the previous site, and I started to relax. That evening, I built a fire and sat quietly, listening to the forest. The usual sounds had returned, and I felt a sense of normalcy creeping back. But as the night deepened, the strange sensations returned. It was subtle at first, a faint rustling that seemed to come from all around me. Then, there was a loud snap, like a tree branch breaking, much closer than I was comfortable with. I shone my flashlight into the darkness but saw nothing. The beam of light seemed to make the forest even darker beyond its reach. I stayed by the fire for hours, too tense to retreat to the tent. The firelight provided some comfort, a small barrier against the unknown. Around midnight, the noises stopped. The silence that followed was even more unsettling. Eventually, exhaustion overtook my fear, and I crawled into my tent, clutching my knife for reassurance. I barely slept. When morning came, I decided to cut my trip short. 2 restless nights and the constant feeling of being watched had worn me down. I packed up quickly, eager to get back to the trailhead. The hike back was grueling. My pack felt heavier, and the forest seemed more oppressive than ever. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves had my heart racing. I felt like I was being followed, though every time I turned around, there was nothing there. About halfway back, I came across something that stopped me in my tracks. On the ground, in the middle of the trail, was a pile of rocks, similar to the ones I'd seen in the clearing. They were arranged in a deliberate pattern, almost like a marker. I hadn't seen them on my way in, and the thought that someone or something had placed them there during my trip was deeply unsettling. I took a wide berth around the rocks and quickened my pace. The last few miles felt like a race. I was moving as fast as I could without breaking into a run, my eyes constantly scanning the forest around me. When I finally reached the trailhead and saw my car, relief washed over me. I threw my pack into the back seat and got in, locking the doors before starting the engine. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd narrowly avoided something I couldn't explain but instinctively knew was dangerous. Looking back, I'm still not sure what happened out there. There were no clear signs of another person, no evidence of wildlife behaving unusually, nothing concrete to point to. But the feeling of being watched, the silence, and the strange rock formations were enough to make me question going camping alone again. The forest is beautiful, but it's also vast and mysterious, and sometimes it's better to leave certain places undisturbed. I've always enjoyed camping. The peace and quiet of the wilderness is something you can't find anywhere else. This particular trip, though, changed the way I think about being alone in the woods. I'd planned a solo camping trip in a remote part of the national forest. It was a 3-hour drive from the nearest town, and from there, I had to hike another 6 miles to reach the spot I'd chosen. It was mid-October, so the air had a crisp edge to it, but the trees still clung to their fiery autumn leaves. The trail was well marked, but there wasn't a single other person in sight. That's exactly how I liked it. My pack was heavy with all the essentials: a tent, sleeping bag, enough food for 3 days, a small cooking kit, and some basic tools. I also carried a GPS device, a map, and a compass, even though I'd hiked this area before and knew it well. I'm not one to take chances, especially when I'm alone. The hike in was uneventful. The only sounds were the crunch of leaves under my boots and the occasional rustle of wildlife in the underbrush. I reached my campsite by mid-afternoon, a flat clearing near a small creek. It was perfect. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and got everything organized. By the time I'd finished, the sun was dipping low, casting long shadows through the trees. As night fell, I lit a fire and cooked a simple meal. The quiet was absolute, broken only by the crackling of the flames and the distant hoot of an owl. I felt completely at ease, enjoying the solitude and the sense of being disconnected from the world. I stayed up for a while, staring at the stars, before finally crawling into my tent and zipping myself into my sleeping bag. The night was cold, but I was warm and comfortable. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure what had disturbed me. The forest was silent, too silent. That's when I noticed a faint, rhythmic sound. It was distant but unmistakable. A dull thud, like something heavy hitting the ground repeatedly. It was coming from the direction of the creek. I lay still, straining to hear more. The sound continued, steady and deliberate. My first thought was that it might be an animal, maybe a deer or a bear, but something about the rhythm didn't seem natural. I told myself it was nothing to worry about and eventually drifted back to sleep. The next morning, the sound was gone, and everything seemed normal. I spent the day exploring the area, taking in the beauty of the forest. I found a few interesting tracks near the creek, but nothing out of the ordinary. By the time I returned to camp, I'd almost forgotten about the noise from the night before. That evening, after another meal cooked over the fire, I settled in for another quiet night. I just started to doze off when I heard it again. The same dull, rhythmic thudding. This time, it seemed closer. My heart began to race as I lay there, listening. It was coming from the direction of the creek, but it sounded like it was moving toward my camp. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent as quietly as I could. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting just enough light to see the immediate area. I scanned the woods with the beam of my flashlight but saw nothing. The sound had stopped. I stood there for a long moment, every nerve on edge, before deciding to stoke the fire and sit by it for a while. The rest of the night passed without incident, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I told myself it was probably just my imagination or some harmless animal behavior. Still, I decided to cut my trip short and head back to the trailhead the next day. The hike out started uneventfully. The morning was cold and clear, and the forest seemed to be back to its normal, peaceful self. But as I got closer to the trailhead, I started noticing strange things. The first was a set of footprints on the trail that hadn't been there before. They were large and unmistakably human, but they didn't look like they belonged to a hiker. The toes were bare, and the strides were uneven, as if the person had been limping or dragging one foot. I felt a chill run down my spine but kept moving. The trail was narrow and wound through dense woods, making it impossible to see far ahead. I kept glancing over my shoulder, feeling a growing sense of unease. At one point, I thought I heard the faint sound of footsteps behind me, but when I stopped to listen, the forest was silent. About a mile from the trailhead, I came across something that made my blood run cold. A crude, makeshift shelter had been constructed just off the trail. It was made of branches and leaves, and inside, there were remnants of a fire and what looked like gnawed animal bones. Whoever had made it had been here recently. I didn't wait to investigate further. I quickened my pace, practically jogging the rest of the way to my car. When I finally reached the parking lot, I was relieved to see it empty, just as I'd left it. I threw my gear into the trunk and got in, locking the doors before starting the engine. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone emerge from the trees. But the road behind me remained empty. It wasn't until I was back in town, surrounded by people and noise, that I began to feel safe again. Even now, I can't explain what happened out there. Maybe it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. Or maybe I wasn't as alone in the woods as I thought. I haven't been camping alone since. Camping had always been my way of disconnecting from the chaos of life. I craved the peace and simplicity of the wilderness. So, when I decided to take a solo trip into the national forest near my hometown, I felt both excited and at ease. I had been to this area before, though never alone, and I trusted myself to handle whatever came my way. I packed everything I thought I'd need: a sturdy tent, sleeping bag, plenty of food, water, a first aid kit, and my trusted multi-tool. I made sure to include a detailed map of the area, even though I had a decent sense of direction. I set out early on a crisp autumn morning. The air was cool and smelled of pine and earth. The leaves were just starting to turn, painting the forest in shades of orange and red. As I hiked deeper into the woods, I felt a sense of freedom that I hadn't experienced in months. The stress of work and daily responsibilities melted away with every step. By midday, I found a secluded spot near a small, clear stream to set up camp. The ground was flat, and the trees offered just enough cover to shield me from the wind without blocking the sunlight. After pitching my tent and organizing my supplies, I spent the afternoon exploring the area. The forest was alive with the sounds of rustling leaves, chirping birds, and the occasional snap of a twig. I followed the stream for a while, marveling at the way it twisted and turned through the landscape. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, I returned to my campsite to prepare dinner. I boiled water for some instant noodles and added a few spices to make it more palatable. It wasn't gourmet, but it was satisfying after a day of hiking. As night fell, the forest transformed. The once inviting trees now loomed like dark sentinels, and the cheerful sounds of daytime gave way to the eerie silence of night. I built a small fire to keep warm and provide some light. Sitting by the fire, I felt a mix of contentment and unease. The isolation was both thrilling and unsettling. I told myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me, that the rustling I occasionally heard beyond the firelight was just the wind or a small animal. When the fire began to die down, I decided to call it a night. I double-checked that my food was secured in a bear-proof container and stowed it a safe distance from my tent. Crawling into my sleeping bag, I felt the exhaustion of the day catch up with me. I fell asleep quickly, lulled by the gentle sound of the stream. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night, disoriented and unsure of what had stirred me. My first thought was that I had heard something, but the forest was silent. I lay still, straining my ears for any sound. Then I heard it, a faint crunch of leaves, followed by another. It wasn't constant, but it was deliberate. My heart began to race as I realized it was the sound of footsteps. Someone, or something, was moving just beyond the edge of my campsite. I told myself it could be a deer or some other animal, but the rhythm of the steps didn't feel right. Animals don't move like that, pausing, then taking a few slow steps, then pausing again. I stayed as quiet as possible, barely breathing. I didn't want to draw attention to myself. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps faded away. I waited, wide-eyed and tense, for any sign of their return, but the forest remained silent. Eventually, exhaustion overcame my fear, and I drifted back to sleep. The next morning, I tried to shake off the unease from the night before. The sun was shining, and the forest felt alive again. I convinced myself that it must have been an animal. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. As I went about my day, I found myself glancing over my shoulder more often than usual. I decided to stick closer to my campsite instead of wandering too far. Around midday, I noticed something strange. A few hundred feet from my camp, I found a tree with deep, fresh scratches running down its trunk. They were too high up to be from a small animal, and the spacing between the marks didn't match the claws of a bear. I couldn't figure out what could have made them. The discovery put me on edge, but I told myself it was just another mystery of the wilderness. That afternoon, I went to refill my water bottles at the stream. As I knelt by the water, I saw something that made my blood run cold. On the opposite bank, partially hidden by the underbrush, was a single boot print. It was large, much larger than my own, and it looked fresh. I scanned the area, my heart pounding, but I didn't see anyone. I decided then and there that I wouldn't spend another night in the forest. I'd pack up and hike back to the trailhead before dark. As I hurried back to my campsite, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. Every now and then, I thought I heard a twig snap or leaves rustle behind me, but whenever I stopped to listen, there was only silence. By the time I reached my campsite, my nerves were frayed. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could, my hands trembling. The sun was already starting to set, and I knew I had limited time to make it back to the trailhead. I strapped on my backpack and started down the trail at a brisk pace. The forest, which had seemed so welcoming the day before, now felt oppressive. Shadows stretched long across the ground, and every sound seemed amplified. As the light faded, I felt the weight of the situation pressing down on me. I was alone, miles from civilization, with no cell service and no guarantee that I'd reach safety before nightfall. About an hour into my hike, I saw something that made my stomach drop. Up ahead, in the middle of the trail, was a small pile of rocks stacked neatly on top of each other. It hadn't been there the day before. Someone had placed it there, and recently. My instinct screamed at me to turn around, but I knew I couldn't. The trailhead was closer than my campsite, and I needed to keep moving forward. I stepped around the pile carefully, my eyes scanning the forest for any sign of movement. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming now, and I couldn't shake the thought that someone was deliberately trying to unnerve me. I quickened my pace, my legs burning from the effort. The trail became harder to follow in the dim light, and I stumbled more than once on exposed roots and rocks. Then I saw it. Just off the trail, partially obscured by trees, was a figure. It was too dark to make out details, but I could see enough to know it was a person. They were standing perfectly still, watching me. My heart pounded in my chest as I forced myself to keep moving. I didn't want to run and risk tripping or drawing more attention to myself, but every instinct screamed at me to get away. As I rounded a bend in the trail, I broke into a jog. My breath came in ragged gasps, and my pulse thundered in my ears. I didn't dare look back. All I could think about was reaching the trailhead and the safety of my car. When I finally saw the parking lot through the trees, relief washed over me. I sprinted the last stretch, my legs shaking with exhaustion and adrenaline. I didn't stop until I was inside my car with the doors locked. Only then did I allow myself to look back toward the trail. The figure was there, standing at the edge of the forest, just barely visible in the fading light. They didn't move, didn't call out, just stood there, watching as I started the engine and drove away. I never went back to that forest. To this day, I don't know who or what was out there with me. All I know is that I've never felt fear like that before, and I hope I never do again. The wilderness may be beautiful, but it's also vast and unforgiving. Sometimes it's better to admire it from a distance. It was supposed to be a simple getaway. I had planned everything down to the last detail. A quiet weekend in the mountains, just me and the wilderness. My job had been draining me, and I desperately needed a break. I found a secluded camping spot deep in the forest, far away from any other campers or hikers. It was exactly what I needed: peace, quiet, and a chance to reset. The drive up the mountain was uneventful. The roads were winding but manageable, and the scenery was breathtaking. Towering pines lined the roads, their tops swaying gently in the wind. The air smelled crisp, clean, and earthy, a stark contrast to the city smog I was used to. When I arrived at the trailhead, the parking lot was empty. It was perfect. I grabbed my backpack, double-checked my supplies, and set off down the trail. The hike to the campsite was about 6 miles. The trail was narrow, flanked by dense trees on either side. Sunlight filtered through the canopy, casting dappled shadows on the ground. The only sounds were the crunch of my boots on the dirt path and the occasional chirp of a bird. I felt a sense of calm wash over me. This was exactly what I needed. When I reached the campsite, I was thrilled. It was a small clearing surrounded by trees, with a clear view of the mountains in the distance. A small stream ran nearby, its gentle babble adding to the serene atmosphere. I set up my tent, unpacked my gear, and built a fire pit using the stones scattered around the area. By the time I was finished, the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. After dinner, I sat by the fire, staring into the flames. The warmth was comforting, and the rhythmic crackle of burning wood was almost hypnotic. I stayed up longer than I intended, reluctant to leave the tranquil scene. Eventually, fatigue won out, and I crawled into my tent. The sleeping bag was warm, and the forest sounds lulled me to sleep. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night. At first, I wasn't sure what had roused me. The forest was quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. I listened intently, my heart beating a little faster than usual. Then I heard it, a faint, rhythmic sound. It was distant, but unmistakable. Footsteps. Someone was walking in the forest. I lay perfectly still, straining to hear more. The footsteps grew louder, closer. They were deliberate, not the aimless wandering of an animal. My mind raced. I was miles away from the nearest road, and I hadn't seen anyone else on the trail. Who could it be? And why were they out here in the middle of the night? The footsteps stopped just outside my campsite. My heart was pounding so loudly I was sure whoever it was could hear it. I reached for the knife I always kept in my backpack, my hand trembling. The fire had died down to embers, and the darkness outside the tent was nearly absolute. I waited, every muscle in my body tense, but the footsteps didn't resume. Minutes passed. Slowly, the tension eased, and I began to convince myself that whoever it was had moved on. Morning came, and with it a sense of relief. The bright sunlight made the fears of the night seem almost silly. I stepped out of my tent and surveyed the campsite. Nothing seemed out of place. I told myself it had probably been a deer or some other animal. After breakfast, I decided to explore the area. I followed the stream for a while, enjoying the tranquility. The forest was beautiful, untouched, and vast. I felt a renewed sense of peace. That peace was shattered when I returned to my campsite. My tent had been slashed open. The contents of my backpack were strewn across the ground. Whoever had been here during the night hadn't left. They had waited until I was gone to ransack my camp. A chill ran down my spine. I looked around, half expecting to see someone lurking in the trees, but the forest was silent. I quickly gathered what I could salvage. My food supply was untouched, but some of my gear was missing, including the extra knife I had packed. The realization that someone out there now had one of my weapons filled me with unease. I debated whether to pack up and leave, but the thought of hiking back to the car alone, with whoever it was possibly following me, was equally frightening. I decided to stay put at least until morning. That night, I built a larger fire, hoping it would deter anyone from approaching. I kept my remaining knife close and didn't bother trying to sleep. Every snap of a twig made my heart race. Hours passed, and nothing happened. Eventually, exhaustion overcame me, and I dozed off. I woke abruptly to the sound of something crashing through the underbrush. I bolted upright, knife in hand. The fire had burned low again, casting flickering shadows. The noise was coming from the direction of the stream. I stood, my legs shaking, and moved toward the sound. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees. Then I saw it, a figure standing at the edge of the light. It was a man dressed in dark clothing. His face was obscured by a hood. He didn't move, didn't say anything. He just stood there, staring at me. My grip on the knife tightened. "What do you want?" I called out, my voice trembling. There was no response. The man took a single step forward and I took a step back. Then, without warning, he turned and disappeared into the trees. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. As soon as dawn broke, I packed up my gear and started the hike back to my car. The trail felt longer than before, every shadow a potential threat. I kept looking over my shoulder, convinced the man was following me, but I never saw him again. When I finally reached the parking lot, my car was the only one there. Relief washed over me as I climbed in and locked the doors. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I don't know who that man was or what he wanted, but I've never been back to that forest since. Camping was supposed to be a way to escape the stress of everyday life, but now it's just another thing that keeps me awake at night. I've always enjoyed camping, the simplicity of it, the way the forest pulls you away from the noise of everyday life. I thought this trip would be no different. My plan was straightforward. 3 days in the wilderness, far from the stresses of work and screens. I chose a remote area I'd read about online, one that promised solitude and beautiful views. It was late October, the air crisp and cool, with a promise of clear skies. Perfect camping weather, or so I thought. The drive out to the trailhead took most of the morning. By the time I parked my car and strapped on my backpack, the sun hung high, casting long golden rays through the thinning trees. The trail started gently enough, winding through the forest with soft rustling sounds of leaves underfoot. The first few miles were uneventful, just me and the rhythm of my steps, my breathing, and the occasional bird call. I reached my planned campsite a little after 3 p.m. It was a small clearing near a shallow stream. The ground was flat and covered in soft moss, and there was a fallen log that would make a good bench. I set up my tent quickly, eager to make the most of the daylight. The tent was a bright orange dome, easy to spot among the browns and greens of the forest. I gathered some wood for a small fire, laid out my sleeping bag, and boiled water for coffee. Everything felt peaceful. As the sun dipped lower, I explored the area a bit. The forest seemed denser than I'd expected. Trees pressed closer together, their branches intertwining like fingers clasped tightly. The stream's gentle gurgle became my anchor in the quiet, a constant sound that reassured me I wasn't completely alone. I didn't stray far, not wanting to lose sight of my camp. By the time I returned, the sun had disappeared behind the treetops, and the shadows stretched long and dark. After dinner, I sat by the fire, letting its warmth soak into my skin. The flames danced and crackled, sending little sparks into the air. The forest around me had grown eerily silent. No wind rustled the leaves, no animals scurried through the underbrush. Just the fire and me. I brushed off the unease, chalking it up to my overactive imagination. Nights in the woods were always like this, quiet, vast, and just a little intimidating. When I finally crawled into my tent, I felt tired but content. The fire had died down to embers, and the cold was creeping in. I zipped up my sleeping bag and tried to relax. The forest outside seemed even quieter now, a silence so deep it felt oppressive. I'd almost drifted off when I heard it, a faint rustling sound, like dry leaves being disturbed. First, I thought it was just an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer, but the sound didn't move away. It stayed in the same spot just outside my camp. My pulse quickened. I strained to hear more, my ears searching for any clue. Then came the unmistakable crunch of a footstep. Not the light, erratic steps of an animal, but a deliberate, heavy tread. Someone was out there. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. My mind raced. Who would be out here this far from the trailhead? And why? I didn't have any weapons, just a small camping knife in my bag. The footsteps continued, slow and deliberate, circling the perimeter of my camp. I couldn't see anything through the thin fabric of the tent, but I could hear every movement. My heart pounded so hard I thought whoever was out there might hear it. Minutes felt like hours. The footsteps eventually faded, replaced by the eerie stillness of the forest. I didn't move, too afraid to make a sound. Sleep was impossible. I lay there in the darkness, every muscle tense, waiting for something, anything to happen. But the night stretched on without incident. When dawn finally broke, I emerged from the tent cautiously, every nerve on edge. The clearing looked the same as it had the day before, except for one thing: footprints. They were human, no doubt about it, and they circled my camp in a wide arc before disappearing into the woods. I stared at them for a long time, trying to make sense of it. The ground was soft enough to preserve the impressions, but they weren't fresh. Whoever had been there last night had left long before morning. I debated whether to pack up and leave, but stubbornness got the better of me. Maybe it had been another hiker, curious about my camp but too shy to approach. That seemed plausible, and I clung to the explanation. I convinced myself I'd overreacted and decided to stick to my plan. But I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The second day passed uneventfully, though I couldn't fully enjoy it. Every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig made me jump. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone standing there, watching, but there was nothing. Just the endless forest and its shadows. That night, I made sure to build a bigger fire, its light a comforting barrier against the encroaching darkness. I stayed up late, watching the flames and listening for any sound out of place. Hours passed without incident, and I began to relax. Maybe whoever had been there the night before was long gone. I was wrong. It was past midnight when I heard it again. Footsteps. This time, they were closer, more deliberate. They didn't circle the camp, but came straight toward it. My blood ran cold. I grabbed my camping knife and sat rigid, staring at the tent door. The footsteps stopped just outside, and then there was silence. No rustling, no movement, just a heavy, suffocating stillness. I stayed like that for what felt like an eternity, gripping the knife so tightly my hand ached. Finally, I worked up the courage to unzip the tent just a fraction, peering out into the darkness. The fire had burned low, its light barely illuminating the clearing. I saw nothing, no movement, no figure, but the sense of being watched was overwhelming. I didn't sleep that night. At the first light of dawn, I packed up my gear as quickly as I could. The footprints were back, fresh this time, and leading away from the camp in a straight line into the woods. I didn't follow them. I didn't want to know where they led. The hike back to the trailhead was the longest of my life. Every step felt like I was being followed, though I never saw or heard anything. When I finally reached my car, I felt a wave of relief so intense it almost brought me to tears. I didn't look back as I drove away. I never reported the incident. What would I have said? That someone walked around my campsite at night? Sounded so trivial, so easy to dismiss. But I've never been camping alone since. Whatever or whoever was out there, I don't want to meet them again. It started as a simple idea, a solo camping trip to clear my head. Work had been a grind, and my apartment in the city felt suffocating. I craved space, quiet, and a chance to breathe. I picked a remote spot in a national forest that wasn't too far from home but far enough to feel like an escape. I'd done my research, read up on the trails, and packed everything I thought I'd need. My gear was basic but reliable: a sturdy tent, a sleeping bag rated for cold weather, plenty of food and water, and a small first aid kit. I even packed a little emergency beacon, just in case. The drive out there was uneventful. The farther I got from the city, the lighter I felt. The dense trees lining the winding roads seemed to whisper promises of peace. I parked my car at a trailhead, shouldered my backpack, and started the hike. The trail was narrow but well marked, snaking through tall pines and rocky outcroppings. The air smelled of earth and pine needles, a sharp contrast to the exhaust and concrete I was used to. The sound of birds and the occasional rustle of leaves filled the silence. After a couple of hours, I reached the clearing where I'd planned to set up camp. It was perfect, a flat patch of ground surrounded by trees, with a small stream nearby for water. I pitched my tent, laid out my gear, and built a small fire. As the sun dipped lower, I sat by the fire, eating a simple meal and enjoying the solitude. The forest seemed alive but calm, with the chirping of crickets and the distant hoot of an owl. By the time darkness fell, I was ready to call it a night. I doused the fire, zipped myself into my tent, and settled into my sleeping bag. The forest was pitch black, the kind of darkness that's hard to find in the city. I drifted off to sleep, feeling content. I woke up suddenly in the middle of the night. At first, I wasn't sure what had startled me. My heart was pounding, and my ears strained to pick up any sound. The forest, which had felt so welcoming earlier, now seemed vast and indifferent. I told myself it was nothing, just the unfamiliar noises of the wild. But then I heard it, a faint rustling sound, like something moving through the underbrush. It was subtle, barely audible, but enough to set me on edge. I lay still, listening. The sound came again, closer this time. My mind raced through possibilities. A deer? A raccoon? I'd read about black bears in the area, but they were supposed to avoid humans. I reached for the small flashlight I'd kept by my side and clicked it on. The beam of light pierced the darkness, illuminating the inside of my tent. I unzipped the flap just enough to peek outside. The forest was still, the underbrush unmoving. I told myself it was just my imagination and forced myself to lie back down. The rest of the night passed uneventfully, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. When dawn broke, I emerged from my tent and checked the area. There were no tracks, no signs of anything unusual. I chalked it up to nerves and decided to stay another night. After all, I'd come here to relax, not scare myself into leaving. The second day was peaceful. I explored the area, following the stream and admiring the dense forest. I found a spot where the water pooled into a small, clear pond and spent an hour just sitting there, soaking in the quiet. When I returned to camp, I cooked a simple meal and watched the sunset through the trees. It was beautiful, the kind of scene that made all the stress and noise of daily life seem far away. That night, I went to bed feeling calmer. But again, I woke up in the middle of the night. This time, the sound was louder and more distinct. It wasn't just rustling. It was the unmistakable crunch of footsteps on dry leaves. My heart thudded in my chest as I strained to listen. The steps were slow, deliberate, and they were circling my campsite. I reached for my flashlight and my small camping knife. The knife felt pitifully inadequate, but it was all I had. I stayed silent, trying to control my breathing as the footsteps continued. They stopped suddenly, and the silence was deafening. I waited, my muscles tense, for what felt like an eternity. Finally, I worked up the courage to unzip the tent and shine my flashlight outside. The beam swept over the trees, the ground, the fire pit. Nothing. No movement. No sign of anyone or anything. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a curious deer, and crawled back into my sleeping bag. But sleep didn't come easily. Every small noise seemed amplified, every shadow sinister. I stayed awake until the first light of dawn, then packed up my camp. I decided to cut the trip short. The solitude I'd sought now felt oppressive, the forest's vastness too isolating. The hike back to my car felt longer than the hike in. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig made me jump. When I finally reached the trailhead and saw my car, I felt a wave of relief. I tossed my gear into the trunk and climbed into the driver's seat. As I turned the key in the ignition, I glanced back toward the trail. For a moment, I thought I saw movement among the trees, but it was gone before I could be sure. The drive home was quiet. The farther I got from the forest, the lighter I felt, but a lingering unease stayed with me. When I got home, I unpacked my gear and found something that made my stomach drop. My emergency beacon, which I'd kept in an outer pocket of my backpack, was missing. I knew I hadn't used it or moved it. It should have been there. I've thought about that trip a lot since then, trying to make sense of what happened. I've told myself it was just nerves, that I'd imagined more than was really there. But the missing beacon bothers me. Someone or something had been out there with me, close enough to take it without me noticing. I haven't been camping since, and I don't think I ever will again. I never considered myself the type to be spooked by nature. Camping was something I loved, a way to get away from everything and just breathe. A weekend trip, just me and the woods, was my idea of relaxation. But that weekend, it changed everything. It started innocently enough. I'd been planning the trip for weeks, just me and my backpack, a simple solo camping experience. I'd picked a spot in a remote area of the national park, far from the usual busy campsites. I wanted solitude, peace, a break from the noise of the world. The weather was perfect for it. Clear skies, a cool breeze, and the trees rustling softly in the wind. Nothing seemed off. I drove out of town early Friday morning, loaded with gear, excited for the quiet weekend ahead. The drive took about 3 hours, winding through small towns and thick forests. I kept my eyes on the road, feeling the anticipation building as the asphalt turned to gravel, signaling I was getting closer to the park. The GPS directed me to a trailhead where I parked my car, grabbed my pack, and started the hike in. The trail was well maintained, though a little less traveled than the more popular routes. It was exactly what I wanted: peaceful, quiet, just me and the trail. The hike was straightforward at first. The forest was thick, with towering trees blocking out much of the sun, casting everything in dappled shade. The trail was winding but easy to follow, and the sound of my boots crunching on the dirt was the only noise I could hear. The air smelled earthy, fresh, exactly what I'd hoped for. After about an hour, I came to a small clearing with a creek running through it. It was the perfect spot to set up camp. I found a flat area just next to the water and unloaded my things. I had a small tent, a sleeping bag, some food, and a portable stove. I set up everything quickly. The sun was starting to dip below the trees, and the air was cooling, so I decided to start a small fire to keep warm and cook some dinner. I made sure the fire was controlled, not too large, but enough to keep the chill away. As the flames crackled, I sat back against a log, feeling the weight of the quietness around me. No cars, no people, just the wind and the crackling of the fire. Felt good. I ate my dinner, just a simple meal, nothing fancy, and then sat back, watching the fire dance in the growing dark. The forest around me seemed to grow more alive as the night settled in. I could hear rustling in the trees and the occasional splash from the creek, but nothing out of the ordinary. By 9 p.m., the fire was low, and I decided it was time to crawl into my tent. The air had cooled significantly, and I was looking forward to a warm sleeping bag and some rest. I climbed into my tent, zipped it up, and lay down. The sounds of the night, the rustling leaves, distant calls of animals, slowly faded as I closed my eyes. For a while, I drifted in and out of sleep, my mind settling into a peaceful rhythm. But then, somewhere in the middle of the night, something woke me up. It was a faint sound at first, just a soft rustling outside my tent. I figured it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, foraging for food. But then the sound got louder. It was definitely too heavy to be a small animal. I sat up, heart pounding a little faster, trying to make sense of it. The noise was coming from just outside my tent, almost like something was circling it. I held my breath, waiting for it to stop, but it didn't. Continued moving in a slow, deliberate pattern. Step, pause, step, pause. Couldn't just lie there. I grabbed my flashlight, trying not to make a sound, and crept to the zipper. Slowly, I unzipped it just a crack, peering out into the darkness. The beam of light cut through the blackness, illuminating nothing but trees and shadows. But that didn't ease the feeling in my gut. Something was out there, something large enough to make that kind of noise. I waited, my heart thumping loudly in my chest, and slowly, the rustling stopped. I didn't hear any more steps. I exhaled in relief, telling myself it was just a bear or something similar, a creature that probably wasn't interested in me. I pulled the zipper back up, wrapped myself in my sleeping bag again, and tried to settle back down. But the unease wouldn't go away. It felt like something was watching me, even though I couldn't see anything. I tossed and turned for what felt like hours, unable to fully relax. The night dragged on, the sounds of the forest creeping around me like shadows in the dark. I finally fell into a restless sleep, but it wasn't long before something woke me again. This time, the sound wasn't distant. It was right outside the tent. I heard a low growl, almost like a growl of warning, but too muffled to fully understand. I froze. My mind raced, trying to identify what it could be. A bear? A wolf? Something larger? I couldn't be sure, but I knew one thing. I wasn't safe. I stayed perfectly still, my body rigid with fear, listening as the growl faded and was replaced by slow, deliberate footsteps. Whoever or whatever was out there, it wasn't leaving. I held my breath, hoping it would go away, but it didn't. The footsteps came closer, and with each step, my heart pounded harder in my chest. I had to act fast. I reached for my flashlight again, and this time I didn't hesitate. I unzipped the tent, pushing it open just enough to shine the beam of light outside. What I saw made my blood run cold. There, just beyond the reach of the light, was a large figure. It was hard to make out the details in the dim glow, but it was big, much bigger than any bear I'd seen before. It stood on two legs, hunched over slightly, and its eyes glowed faintly in the dark. My mind raced, but the only thing I could do was keep my flashlight trained on it, praying it wouldn't come any closer. Then, it did something that shook me to my core. It turned and disappeared into the trees. The sound of its steps faded into the distance, leaving behind an eerie silence. I didn't sleep after that. I sat there, wide awake, listening for any more sounds, but it was quiet, too quiet. Eventually, the first light of dawn broke through the trees, and I knew I couldn't stay there any longer. I packed up my things as quickly as I could, every nerve in my body on edge, and hiked out of the woods as fast as I could. I didn't go back to that spot. I found another campsite farther along the trail, one closer to the ranger station, and set up camp there for the rest of the weekend. But I never forgot the feeling of being watched, the growl I heard, the glowing eyes. I've been camping many times since, but that experience changed me. The woods are beautiful, but now, whenever I go, I can't shake the feeling that something might be lurking just beyond the trees, waiting to remind me of that night. I've never told anyone the full story. Maybe they wouldn't believe me. Maybe I wouldn't believe it myself if it hadn't happened to me. But that night, I know what I heard, and I know I was not alone in those woods. I've always loved the idea of camping, being out in nature, disconnected from the world, and experiencing the peace that comes with it. A few years ago, I decided to take a solo camping trip in a remote area that I had heard about from a few friends. They said it was a peaceful place, the perfect spot to get away from everything and clear your mind. It was about a 3-hour hike into the forest, and the remoteness of it was exactly what I wanted. I packed all my gear the night before: tent, sleeping bag, food, water, a flashlight, my knife, and a map. Everything I thought I'd need for a few days in the wilderness. I told a friend where I was going just in case. They thought it was a bit risky to go alone, but I brushed it off. I had camped solo before and had always been fine. The hike started early in the morning, with the sun just beginning to rise over the horizon. The air was crisp, and the trail was quiet, except for the occasional rustle of leaves as animals moved through the underbrush. The trees around me were tall and dense, their leaves a deep green that darkened as I ventured further into the forest. I felt good, strong, and confident. The trail was well marked, and I was making good progress, so I didn't feel rushed. By the time I reached the area where I planned to set up camp, the sun was high in the sky. The spot was perfect. A small clearing next to a bubbling creek, surrounded by tall pine trees. It was peaceful, and I thought it would be a good place to relax and unwind for the next few days. I set up my tent near the creek, careful to make sure it was positioned well enough to avoid any unexpected flooding from the water. I spent the first day just enjoying the solitude. The sound of the creek was soothing, and I took a long walk around the area to explore. The forest felt vast and alive, but I was still within range of the trail, so I felt safe. The only thing that bothered me slightly was the lack of any other people. I didn't see anyone on the trail on the way in, and I hadn't seen anyone around the clearing. It wasn't a huge deal, but I figured it was odd. Normally, on trails like this, you'd run into at least a few other campers. That night, I sat by the campfire and made dinner. The smell of the food mixed with the fresh, pine-scented air, and the crackling of the fire was the only sound that broke the silence. As the evening wore on, I began to feel a strange sense of unease, but I pushed it aside. It was probably just my mind playing tricks on me in the stillness of the night. I went to bed early, hoping to get some rest for the hike the next day. The inside of the tent was cozy, and I quickly settled into my sleeping bag. But as I lay there in the dark, listening to the sounds of the forest, I started to feel uneasy again. The usual noises of the wilderness, the rustling of leaves, the chirping of insects, seemed to have quieted down. Everything felt still, almost too still. Around midnight, I was woken by a sudden noise from outside. It sounded like something large moving through the trees, branches snapping and leaves crunching. I froze. My first thought was that it was an animal, a deer or a bear, maybe, but then I realized that the noise was too deliberate. It wasn't the usual sounds of wildlife. It was almost like someone was walking through the forest. I lay still, heart pounding, trying to listen for any other sounds. But nothing came. The forest was silent again. I stayed there for a long time, not sure what to think. I told myself it was nothing, just the wind or an animal, and eventually, I managed to fall back asleep. The next morning, I woke up to a cold, overcast sky. It was unusual for this time of year, but I figured it was just the weather shifting. After a quick breakfast, I decided to go for a hike to clear my mind. I figured I would feel better if I got out into the forest and kept my mind busy. As I walked deeper into the woods, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The woods felt different today, heavier somehow. The wind had picked up, and the trees creaked above me, casting strange shadows on the ground. I glanced behind me a few times, but there was nothing there, just the trail stretching out behind me. I took a few more steps, trying to focus on the path, but I couldn't ignore the unsettling feeling that had settled deep in my gut. It was as if someone was watching me. I quickened my pace, my boots crunching on the forest floor, but no matter how fast I walked, the feeling didn't go away. When I reached a small ridge, I decided to turn back. The unease had built up to the point where I didn't want to be out here alone anymore. As I retraced my steps back to the clearing, I noticed something strange. The trail had changed. It wasn't a huge difference, but the markings on the trees that I had relied on earlier to navigate seemed off. The orange paint on the trunks was smeared, and there were new scratches on the bark. I didn't remember seeing those before, and I was sure I hadn't made them myself. I tried to stay calm, telling myself I was just overthinking things, but my anxiety was building. When I finally reached my camp, I breathed a sigh of relief. But as I entered the clearing, I immediately noticed something else. My tent had been moved. The tent was still standing, but it was positioned differently. The guy lines were no longer taut. They were slack, as if someone had gone inside and shifted it around. I stood there for a long moment, frozen, trying to figure out what was going on. I was sure I had set it up right the night before. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but there was no denying that someone had been here. I immediately grabbed my knife and went to check the area around my tent. But there was no sign of anyone. No footprints, no signs of struggle, just the quiet of the forest. I sat down by the creek, trying to think through what I should do. I knew it was getting late, and I didn't want to spend another night here if someone else was around. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I thought about the odd noises I had heard the night before. I couldn't ignore it anymore, but as the sun started to set, I made my decision. I would pack up and leave. There was something wrong here, something I couldn't explain. I spent the next hour packing everything up, making sure I didn't leave anything behind. I kept my knife in hand, my eyes scanning the trees around me. I didn't want to seem paranoid, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. By the time I was finished, it was almost dark. I made my way back to the trail, my eyes darting between the trees. It wasn't the wilderness I had come to enjoy anymore. It felt like a different world, one that I wasn't supposed to be in. As I walked along the trail, I kept hearing rustling behind me. Every time I turned around, there was nothing there, but the sounds continued, just out of sight, always at the edge of my hearing. Finally, after what felt like hours, I reached the trailhead. The parking lot was empty, and the evening sky was now a deep purple. I let out a long breath, feeling the weight of the experience lift off my shoulders. I didn't know what had happened in those woods, but I was glad to be away from it. I knew I would never come back, not to that place, not after what I had felt. As I drove away, I couldn't help but wonder, had someone been watching me all along, or was it just my mind playing tricks? Either way, I didn't plan to find out. I've always found peace in nature, the deep quiet, the open sky, and the fresh mountain air. There's something soothing about escaping from the chaos of daily life and letting the natural world take over for a while. So when I decided to go camping alone for the weekend, it wasn't really out of the ordinary. I'd done it many times before, but this time something felt different. I chose a small, secluded spot up in the mountains. It was a place I'd heard about from a friend who described it as a hidden gem, far enough from the usual trails that you could really get away from everything. There were no signs of civilization up there. No roads, no hikers, just the quiet hum of nature. It sounded perfect. The hike was tough, but I was used to it. I carried a heavy backpack with all my gear: tent, sleeping bag, food, water, and a few other necessities. I kept a steady pace, breathing in the crisp air as I made my way through the forest. The path wound through tall pines, across rushing streams, and over rocky terrain. It took me almost 5 hours to get to the site, but when I finally arrived, the exhaustion faded away, replaced by a sense of satisfaction. The campsite was exactly what I had imagined. A small, open clearing surrounded by dense woods. The sun was starting to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the ground. I felt a little thrill run through me as I realized that I was truly alone out here. No one else for miles, just me and the wilderness. I set up camp quickly. The ground was soft and slightly uneven, but I found a good spot to pitch my tent. I unpacked my stove and cooking supplies, heated up some food, and settled by the fire I built. The flames danced and crackled, the warmth a welcome contrast to the cooling evening air. But as I sat there, I began to notice how still everything was. Normally, when you're camping, there are sounds: crickets, birds, the rustling of animals in the underbrush. But here it was eerily quiet. The usual forest sounds were missing. I kept glancing around, expecting to see an animal pass through the trees, but nothing, just silence. I tried to shrug it off. Maybe it was just the location. After all, this was a pretty remote spot. Maybe the wildlife had just migrated to other areas. But as the night wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I stoked the fire, trying to ignore the growing unease in the pit of my stomach. The flames flickered and crackled, but the darkness around me seemed to deepen with every passing minute. I could hear my own heartbeat, thumping loudly in the quiet. That's when I heard it. A low, guttural growl came from the trees deeper in the forest. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, the product of too much solitude and too many horror movies. But then it came again, closer this time, a menacing sound that seemed to echo through the night. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. There was no mistaking it now. Something or someone was out there. I stood up slowly, my heart racing. I grabbed my flashlight, shining it in the direction of the sound. But the beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but trees and shadows. The growl came again, louder this time, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I was no expert on animal sounds, but that growl didn't sound like anything I'd ever heard before. It wasn't the sound of a bear, or a coyote, or even a wolf. It was something deeper, more guttural, more unsettling. The kind of sound that made every hair on the back of your neck stand up. I glanced at my tent, wondering if I should retreat inside. But there was something in my gut telling me not to. I needed to know what was out there, what was making that sound. So, against my better judgment, I grabbed my knife, slung it over my shoulder, and began to move toward the sound. I walked slowly, carefully, keeping my flashlight aimed at the ground in front of me. The forest around me was pitch black now, the trees towering above me like silent sentinels. The only sound was the crunch of leaves beneath my boots and the occasional rustling in the underbrush. As I walked, the growl came again, this time much closer. I stopped dead in my tracks, my flashlight shaking in my hand. The sound seemed to come from directly in front of me. I took a few cautious steps forward, the tension in my body building with each movement. Then I saw something. It was just a flash, a movement in the trees, but it was enough. Something big, too big to be a deer or a raccoon, was lurking just out of sight. My heart pounded in my chest. I couldn't see it clearly, but I knew it was watching me. I slowly took a step back, my instincts telling me that I needed to get back to the camp. But as I turned, the growl came again, this time from behind me. I spun around, shining the flashlight in every direction. The beam swept across the trees, the ground, the dark shadows of the forest. But there was nothing but the sound of my own breathing, rapid and shallow. I felt the panic rising in my chest. There was no way I could stay out here. Whatever was out there was watching me, and I didn't know what it wanted, but I knew it wasn't friendly. I ran back toward the campsite, my legs burning as I pushed myself harder than I had in years. My breath came in ragged gasps, and my mind raced, imagining all the horrible things that could be following me through the trees. The growls came again, closer now, but I didn't dare look back. I reached the campsite in what felt like seconds, though I knew it had taken longer. I dove into my tent, zipping it up as quickly as I could. My heart was hammering in my chest, and I could still hear the growls echoing through the trees, getting closer and closer. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it toward the entrance of the tent, my grip tight on the knife in my hand. I knew I wasn't safe, not yet. I could still hear it out there, the thing in the woods, pacing just beyond the light's reach. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. The growling stopped, and the silence returned. But this time, it wasn't the peaceful silence of nature. It was oppressive, suffocating. I lay there in the dark, staring at the entrance of the tent, waiting for whatever was out there to make its move. But it didn't. The growls never came again. The minutes stretched on, and I realized that whatever had been lurking in the woods was gone. The night passed slowly, but it eventually gave way to morning. The first light of dawn filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the campsite. I hadn't slept a wink, but I was alive, and that was all that mattered. I packed up my gear quickly, my hands shaking as I moved. I didn't want to linger, didn't want to risk another encounter with whatever had been in the woods. I left the campsite without looking back, hiking down the trail as fast as I could. The whole way down, I kept expecting to hear the growls again, or to see something moving in the trees, but nothing happened. The silence was almost comforting now. When I finally made it back to my car, I didn't waste any time. I threw my gear in the trunk, slammed the door shut, and drove away, the gravel of the road crunching under my tires. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town, far from the woods, far from the place that had nearly become my grave. I never found out what it was that had been watching me, and I don't think I ever want to know. All I know is that it was real. Whatever it was out there in those woods waiting, and I'm never going back. The wilderness had always been a place of peace for me, but now it's something else, something darker, something to fear. And I'll never forget the growls that echoed through the trees that night. I had been camping for years, always seeking out new, isolated spots where the world felt far away. There was something about being in the wilderness, away from the noise and chaos of modern life, that brought me peace. But that particular trip to a secluded area deep in the woods was different. I remember the day I arrived like it was yesterday. The sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows through the trees. The air was crisp, and the leaves crunched underfoot as I made my way to the clearing where I'd set up camp. I had decided to go solo for this trip, no distractions, just me and the forest. It felt like the perfect place to disconnect and unwind. The first night passed quietly. The only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the occasional call of a distant bird. My campfire crackled as I sat around it, staring into the flames. There's something hypnotic about a fire, its unpredictability, the way it dances and changes. I had spent hours just watching it, lost in thought. I cooked some basic camp food, made a small cup of coffee, and listened to the sounds of the forest. There was a certain stillness to it all. It was peaceful, almost serene. As the night grew darker, I zipped up my tent and crawled into my sleeping bag. The warmth from the fire still clung to my skin, but the cold night air seeped through the fabric of the tent. I tried to sleep, but something about the stillness felt off. Maybe it was the way the trees seemed to press in around me, or how every little sound in the woods felt amplified in the quiet of the night. but sleep eventually took over. The next morning, I woke up with the first light. I stretched, the soreness in my muscles reminding me of how far I'd hiked to get there. My plan was to spend a few days out here, exploring the trails and finding new spots to enjoy. But I quickly realized something was wrong. As I was packing up my gear, I noticed something odd. A few of the items I had left out overnight were not where I had left them. My small stove was a few feet away from where I had placed it. My knife, which had been lying on the ground near my tent, was now sitting on a log, almost like someone had moved it. I was alone. No one had passed through the area, and I hadn't heard any footsteps or voices during the night. I was certain of that. At first, I brushed it off as a trick of the mind. Maybe I had forgotten where I placed things. But deep down, a sense of unease settled in. I packed up the rest of my things quickly and decided to head deeper into the woods, hoping the unsettling feeling would pass once I got moving. As I walked along the narrow trail, I kept hearing little noises behind me. A twig snapping, a rustle of leaves. I turned around each time, but nothing was there. The forest seemed oddly quiet, though. No birds singing, no insects buzzing, just silence. Felt wrong. I decided to set up camp again after a few hours of hiking, hoping to shake off the strange feeling. The place I chose was a small clearing near a stream, surrounded by thick trees. I gathered some firewood and set up my tent. As I worked, I couldn't shake the sense that I was being watched. Every time I looked up, I thought I saw movement between the trees, but when I focused on the spot, there was nothing. That night, I sat by the fire again, trying to relax. The crackling of the fire was the only thing that seemed real. I ate, read a bit, and tried to calm myself. But as the hours passed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I found myself looking over my shoulder more than once. I heard something faint, a sound, like soft footsteps on the forest floor. But when I turned around, there was nothing. It happened again, and then again. Each time, I looked behind me, but there was no one there. I grabbed my flashlight and swept the beam across the clearing. The trees stood silent and still, shadows stretching long in the night. I stayed up late that night, waiting for whatever it was to reveal itself, but nothing ever did. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I fell into a restless sleep. The next day, I decided to leave. I didn't want to risk staying out there any longer, not with that strange feeling lingering over me. But as I packed up my gear, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The tracks. There were footprints in the dirt around my campsite. Large, heavy prints, as if someone had been walking in a circle around my tent during the night. But no one had passed by. The ground was too soft for an animal to leave such distinct tracks, and they were too far apart to be human. I froze. The unease I had been feeling suddenly snapped into something much worse. Something had been here while I was asleep. I thought back to the previous night, to the footsteps I had heard around the campfire. They hadn't been my imagination. Someone had been walking in the woods with me. I decided to leave immediately. I grabbed my backpack and hastily packed up the last of my gear. As I made my way down the trail, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. The air seemed thick, oppressive, like I wasn't welcome here anymore. Every step I took, I heard something moving behind me, just out of sight. I broke into a cold sweat, my heart racing. By midday, I was nearing the edge of the forest, but the sounds of movement still followed me. The air felt heavy, and the forest seemed to close in on me. I couldn't get out fast enough. Every time I turned around, I saw nothing but trees, but I could feel eyes on me. Just as I was about to make it to the open fields near the road, I heard a crash, a loud, sudden noise that came from the direction I had just come from. My breath caught in my throat. I looked back, but nothing was there. Not a single sound, not a rustle in the leaves. It was as if the forest itself had fallen silent. Then I saw it, a shadow moving between the trees, just beyond the edge of my vision. It was large, tall, and it moved quickly. My legs froze. I didn't know what it was, but every instinct in my body screamed at me to run. And I did. I sprinted as fast as I could, heart pounding in my chest. The forest blurred around me as I pushed myself harder, faster. I didn't look back, couldn't afford to. I could hear footsteps behind me again, faster now, almost like something was gaining on me. I didn't stop until I burst out into the clearing near the road. The sun had finally risen high enough to light up the area, and I could see the trail leading out of the woods. My legs felt like they were on fire, but I didn't care. I didn't stop until I reached the car. I slammed the door shut and locked it. I didn't take a moment to breathe or gather myself. I just started the engine and drove away, my eyes glued to the rearview mirror. The woods were still there, the trees standing tall in the distance, but I didn't see anything in them. Still, the feeling of being watched didn't fade until I hit the highway and the forest was far behind me. To this day, I don't know what happened out there, who or what was following me. But one thing I do know is that there's something in the woods. Something that's not friendly. Something that doesn't want you there. I learned that the hard way. Since that trip, I haven't gone camping alone again. And whenever I'm out in the woods, I can't help but feel a little nervous. I never hear footsteps following me anymore, but I always feel like there's someone just out of sight, watching, waiting. I'll never forget that trip. I'll never forget the woods, because whatever was out there, it was real. I've always loved camping. There's something about being out in the wilderness, surrounded by trees and silence, that feels so freeing. Last summer, I decided to take a solo trip. I've been hiking and camping in the mountains for years, so I wasn't exactly a beginner. I knew how to read maps, make a fire, and survive in the woods. But this time, I made a mistake. One that I wouldn't realize until it was far too late. I drove up to the trailhead in the early afternoon. The sun was still high in the sky, and the temperature was perfect for a hike. Cool enough to keep me comfortable, but warm enough that I wouldn't have to worry about freezing at night. My backpack was packed with all the essentials: food, water, a first aid kit, a flashlight, a sleeping bag, and a tent. I double-checked everything before locking my car and setting off down the trail. The trail I chose was one I'd never hiked before. It was supposed to be a relatively easy path, leading to a scenic overlook with a beautiful view of the valley below. The sign at the trailhead warned about some steep sections, but nothing I couldn't handle. I'd hiked tougher trails before. I figured it would be a nice, relaxing hike. What I didn't know was that this trail had a reputation. Not many people hiked it, and the ones who did said they'd never come back. But I didn't know any of this, and I wasn't about to let that scare me off. The first few miles of the hike were peaceful. The path was well marked, and the sound of my boots crunching on the dirt and leaves was the only noise that broke the silence. I stopped a couple of times to take in the views, marveling at the way the sunlight filtered through the trees. It felt good to be out here alone. No distractions, just me and the wilderness. As I hiked deeper into the woods, the trail became less defined. It wasn't long before I was pushing through thick underbrush, the trees closing in around me. I could hear birds chirping in the distance, but it was quiet otherwise. Too quiet. That's when I first noticed it. A feeling deep in my gut. Something was off, but I brushed it aside. I'd been hiking alone before, and I'd always been fine. Maybe it was just my imagination. It wasn't long before I came across the first sign that something was wrong. The trail forked, but there was no sign to indicate which way to go. I checked my map and saw that the trail should have been a straight path, but the map didn't match what was in front of me. The fork wasn't on the map. I looked around, hoping to see some kind of marker, but there was nothing. It was just the trees and the dirt, stretching on endlessly. I chose to take the left path, figuring it would eventually lead me to where I needed to go. But the further I walked, the more confused I became. The trail started to disappear, swallowed up by the dense forest. I pulled out my map again and checked my compass, but neither seemed to match where I was. I could feel the panic starting to set in. I was lost. I had been lost before, but never like this. Normally, I'd turn around and retrace my steps, but out here everything looked the same. There was no trail to follow back, no clear way to go. I stopped and took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. I had to keep it together. I could still hear the distant sound of water, so I knew there must be a stream or river nearby. If I could find that, I could follow it downstream and eventually find my way to a campsite or the trailhead. That's when I heard it, the sound of something crashing through the underbrush behind me. My heart skipped a beat. I spun around, expecting to see some kind of animal, but there was nothing, just the thick woods, standing still and silent. I stared into the trees, waiting for something to move, but nothing did. I was starting to feel paranoid. Maybe it was a deer or a bear, or maybe it was something else. I didn't know, and I didn't care to find out. I decided to keep moving, hoping to put some distance between myself and whatever was out there. But the further I walked, the more disoriented I became. The trees were taller here, the ground more uneven. The air felt heavier, like something was pressing down on me. My legs were starting to ache, and I hadn't even set up camp yet. It was getting late, and I needed to find a good spot to camp for the night. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. As the light started to fade, I found a small clearing. I decided to set up camp there, hoping that it would be safe for the night. I pitched my tent quickly, making sure it was secure and facing away from the trees. I gathered some firewood, although I was reluctant to light a fire. There was something about the forest that felt wrong. Too quiet, too still. But I knew I needed the warmth and light, so I set it alight anyway. As the fire crackled and popped, I sat back, trying to relax. The warmth felt good, but the feeling of unease didn't go away. I kept hearing strange noises from the woods, snapping twigs, rustling leaves. I tried to tell myself it was just animals, but every now and then, I would swear I heard footsteps. Not animal footsteps, but something heavier, something more deliberate. I'd look up, and there would be nothing, just the trees stretching off into the darkness. I didn't sleep well that night. I kept waking up, the feeling of being watched growing stronger each time. By morning, I was exhausted, but I had to keep going. I packed up my gear and decided to try to find my way back to the trailhead. The forest seemed even denser now, the trees closing in around me. My compass was still pointing in the wrong direction, and my map was nearly useless. I wasn't sure where I was anymore. The hours passed, and I found myself walking in circles. My legs were aching, and I hadn't had much to drink since the day before. I was thirsty, hungry, and beginning to feel the weight of the situation. I tried to stay calm, but it was hard. The isolation, the silence, the sense of dread in the air. It was all too much. I was starting to think that maybe I wouldn't make it out of here. That's when I saw it. A small, weathered shack in the distance. It wasn't much, just a rundown building that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. But it was something. Maybe someone lived there, maybe they could help. I started toward it, desperate for any sign of life. It was supposed to be just another camping trip, a break from everything. I had been cooped up in the city for weeks, drowning in work and daily stress. My friends suggested we take a few days off, head into the mountains, and set up camp in a spot far enough from the crowd that we could get some peace and quiet. It sounded perfect. Nature, fresh air, and no distractions. exactly what I needed. We arrived at the campsite after a long, bumpy drive, with the sun still high in the sky. The forest stretched out before us like a vast sea of green, with tall pines and thick underbrush. There was a lake nearby, its surface shimmering like glass under the sunlight. It was a peaceful scene, almost too peaceful. We set up camp near the lake, where the sound of water lapping against the shore made everything feel even more serene. The first night was calm. We built a fire, roasted marshmallows, and talked about everything and nothing. The sky above us was a blanket of stars, and the sounds of the forest were all around: crickets chirping, the occasional rustling of leaves, and distant owl calls. I felt relaxed for the first time in what felt like forever. But something started to gnaw at me, a feeling I couldn't quite place. It was late when we finally decided to call it a night. I crawled into my sleeping bag, the cool air seeping in through the gaps in the tent. I tried to ignore the slight unease bubbling in my chest, telling myself it was just nerves from the long drive. I closed my eyes and let the sounds of the night surround me, hoping for sleep. But sleep didn't come. I lay there wide awake, listening. The usual forest noises were still there: the rustling of leaves, the croaking of frogs, the occasional splash of water. But then, there was something else. A faint sound, like footsteps, but too light, too deliberate. At first, I thought it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, moving through the underbrush. But then it happened again. A faint crunch of dry leaves, just beyond the edge of the campfire's glow. My heart began to race. It was too quiet for an animal, too deliberate to be a random sound. I lay still, barely breathing, straining my ears to hear better. The footsteps stopped, and then, after what felt like an eternity, I heard something worse: whispers, soft, indistinct murmurs, coming from the direction of the forest. I told myself it was the wind, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I was about to get up and check, when I heard it: a loud crack of a branch breaking, followed by the unmistakable sound of something large moving through the woods. My breath caught in my throat, and I froze. Whatever it was not an animal. I could hear the weight of it, the heavy footfalls that sent vibrations through the ground. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I struggled to control my breathing. I waited for what felt like hours, but nothing else happened. The sounds stopped. The whispers faded. Eventually, I must have drifted off to sleep, though it wasn't a restful sleep. My dreams were filled with images of the forest, of shadowy figures moving between the trees, of that same heavy presence I had felt earlier. Morning came, bright and clear. The sun was up, birds were chirping, and everything seemed calm again. My friends were already up and moving around, cooking breakfast on the campfire. I didn't mention what happened during the night. I didn't want to sound paranoid or crazy, and besides, I figured it was just my imagination running wild. I told myself I was overthinking things. The day passed uneventfully, with a hike through the woods and a swim in the lake. But as night began to fall again, that same sense of unease returned. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching. I didn't want to bring it up, but I noticed my friends acting a bit off too. They were quieter than usual, and none of us seemed to want to venture too far from the campfire. That night, we made sure the fire burned bright, and we kept a watchful eye on the trees around us. The whispers never came back, but there was still that unsettling presence. We could hear things moving just out of sight: branches snapping, leaves rustling, the occasional grunt or growl. But every time we looked, we saw nothing. It was on the third night when everything changed. We had just finished our dinner when we heard something we couldn't ignore. A scream. A long, high-pitched scream that echoed through the trees. It wasn't an animal. No animal sounded like that. The scream was followed by a loud crash, like something or someone crashing through the underbrush. My heart skipped a beat, and we all looked at each other in stunned silence. The air seemed to freeze, thick with tension. We knew we couldn't just sit there. We grabbed our flashlights and weapons. Nothing too serious, just a couple of knives and a metal rod we used for poking the fire, and cautiously made our way toward the sound. The forest was eerily silent now, the usual noises gone. We moved slowly, carefully, the beam of our flashlights cutting through the dark. The trees loomed overhead, their shadows stretching long and dark in the faint light. As we walked, the air grew colder, the hairs on the back of my neck prickling. We didn't find anything. No signs of struggle, no blood, nothing out of the ordinary. But the feeling of being watched never left. Every time we stopped, I could swear I heard footsteps behind us. We turned around, shining our lights in every direction, but there was nothing. We decided to head back to the camp, but the feeling only grew stronger. Something was out there. We could feel it. I was convinced we were being stalked, followed by something or someone who didn't want us there. That night, none of us could sleep. We stayed up, watching the trees, listening for any sound, but the forest was dead silent. Every little noise set us on edge, branches creaking, the wind rustling the leaves, even the sound of our own breathing. It felt like we were in the middle of some sort of trap, and we were the prey. As dawn broke, we decided to leave. We packed up quickly, not wanting to waste any more time in that cursed place. We hadn't seen anything for hours, but the feeling of being watched never left. When we finally drove out of the woods, I breathed a sigh of relief. The tension that had gripped me for days finally started to lift, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been watching us was still there, lurking just beyond the trees. I never went back to that campsite, and I'll never forget the feeling of being hunted, of being so small and powerless in the face of something I couldn't even understand. Whatever it was that followed us, it was real, and it wasn't the forest. It wasn't an animal. It was something else, something far worse. It was supposed to be a simple camping trip, a weekend getaway to clear my mind. After the hectic few months I'd had, I thought a couple of days in the woods would do me some good. I'd been to this spot before, so it felt familiar, comfortable. Nestled in the middle of a thick forest, near a small, trickling creek that would lull you to sleep, it was the perfect place to relax. But I had no idea that this trip would turn into something far more terrifying than I ever expected. I arrived late in the afternoon, with the sun still hanging low in the sky, casting long shadows through the trees. The forest had a certain smell, earthy, damp, with a hint of pine. It always felt alive, even in the quietest moments. I parked my car at the trailhead and began to make my way to the campsite, about a mile into the woods. It wasn't a tough hike, but it was enough to make me break a sweat, especially with the heavy pack on my back. The path was narrow, twisting around trees, and sometimes dipping into small ravines. The sound of my boots crunching over the forest floor echoed around me, accompanied by the occasional call of a bird or the rustling of leaves. I had always loved the solitude of the woods. Out here, there were no distractions, no emails, no phone calls, just nature. I reached the campsite around 5:30 p.m. and immediately began setting up my tent. It was a simple two-person tent, nothing fancy, but it had always done the job. The area was quiet, with only the sound of the creek running nearby. I set my tent up near a large, flat rock beside the water, a perfect spot to sit and listen to the soothing rush of the creek. The sky above was still clear, and I could see the first stars beginning to emerge. It was peaceful. As the evening wore on, I built a small campfire, just enough to keep the chill off as the temperature started to drop. The flames crackled and danced, casting flickering shadows on the surrounding trees. I had a small cooler with me, filled with a few cans of beans and some sausages for dinner. It was nothing extravagant, but I didn't mind. There was something comforting about cooking over an open fire. The smell of food wafting through the crisp air felt almost magical in its simplicity. I ate slowly, savoring every bite as I watched the fire burn down to embers. By the time I finished, the night had fully settled in. The temperature had dropped considerably, and the woods around me seemed even quieter than before. The occasional rustling in the trees made me think of animals. Probably deer, maybe a raccoon, but there was nothing that suggested anything out of the ordinary. I sat back, staring into the fire, lost in thought. My mind wandered back to the busy city life I had left behind. The constant rush, the noise, the people. It all seemed so far away now. I come out here to forget, to relax, to breathe. But as the fire died down and the shadows grew longer, I started to feel uneasy. It wasn't anything I could point to exactly. It wasn't like I heard anything strange or saw anything out of the ordinary. But there was a feeling that something was watching me. I brushed it off at first. It was just the dark, the solitude. I was alone in the woods, and sometimes your mind plays tricks on you in situations like this. Still, the feeling lingered. The fire eventually burned out, and I sat there in complete darkness for a moment, letting my eyes adjust. The stars overhead were bright, but the forest around me was an abyss. I reached for the lantern I had hanging on the side of my tent and turned it on. The soft glow illuminated the area around me, casting long shadows on the trees. That's when I heard it, a soft snap of a twig. It came from deeper in the woods, just beyond the reach of the lantern's light. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze. I listened closely, my senses heightened. There was no wind tonight, no sound of rain, just the faint sound of the creek and that twig. Another snap, then a low rustle. I knew it was probably just an animal, deer maybe, or a bear, though I wasn't sure bears even roamed these parts. I tried to calm myself, but the uneasy feeling returned, stronger than before. The darkness just beyond the light seemed to press in on me, and my mind began to race. Was I alone? I stood up, grabbing my flashlight from my pack. Slowly, I shined the beam into the woods, scanning the tree line. Nothing, just shadows, the flickering shapes of trees swaying in the gentle breeze. I laughed nervously, trying to shake off the anxiety. I was being ridiculous. It was just an animal, probably a deer passing by. I turned off the flashlight and sat back down, trying to focus on the crackling sound of the embers. But I couldn't stop the feeling that something wasn't right. The night felt too still, too quiet. Even the usual rustling of small critters seemed to have stopped. Minutes stretched on. The rustling came again, closer this time. Then the snap of a twig. I froze again, gripping the flashlight so tightly my knuckles ached. I waited, every muscle in my body tensed. The sound didn't come again, but I couldn't shake the sensation that I wasn't alone anymore. Then I heard something worse, a sound I couldn't quite explain. A low, almost imperceptible scraping noise, like something was dragging across the ground. My heart pounded in my chest. My breath came in short bursts, but I couldn't make myself move. I stayed there, staring into the darkness, waiting for whatever it was to reveal itself. The noise stopped as suddenly as it had started. I waited a few more minutes, but nothing happened. The air felt thick with tension, and I could hear the sound of my own heartbeat in my ears. I decided I'd had enough. I wasn't going to sit out here alone, listening to these noises all night. I grabbed my things and decided to pack it in, but the moment I stood up, I heard it again. A loud, deliberate snap of a twig. Right behind me, I spun around, shining the flashlight toward the noise. My heart stopped when I saw it. Movement. Something tall and dark stood just beyond the edge of the light, barely visible through the trees. It wasn't an animal. It was too human-shaped, too large. I didn't know what to do. Should I run? Should I call for help? But no one was around for miles, and my phone had no signal. The dark figure didn't move at first, standing there just beyond the light. It was almost like it was waiting, watching. Then it took a step forward. I didn't waste another second. I grabbed my bag, shoved everything into it, and ran. I didn't even think about where I was going. I just ran, my feet pounding the ground, the weight of the pack slowing me down but not enough to stop me. The sound of my own breath and the pounding of my heart filled my ears as I ran through the woods, branches scraping at my arms, the flashlight bouncing wildly in my hand. I could still hear the footsteps behind me, but I didn't dare look back. I just kept running. My legs were burning, but I pushed through it, moving as fast as I could. The woods around me were a blur, the trees and shadows seeming to twist and shift in my peripheral vision. I didn't know how far I ran, but it felt like an eternity. My legs were giving out, but I pushed myself harder, finally breaking through the tree line and stumbling onto the dirt path that led back to the trailhead. The moment I stepped onto that path, the noise behind me stopped. The air felt lighter, the tension that had gripped me loosening slightly. But I didn't stop. I didn't even hesitate. I kept running, my lungs aching for breath, until I reached my car. I threw open the door, jumped inside, and slammed it shut. I didn't even look back as I started the engine. I didn't care. I just drove. The drive out of the woods felt like the longest part of the whole ordeal. My hands were shaking, my mind racing with what had just happened. I didn't understand what I'd seen. I didn't know what that figure had been or why it had followed me. All I knew was that I wasn't going back to that campsite. Not ever. When I finally reached the nearest town, I stopped at a gas station, took a deep breath, and tried to calm myself. The night air felt strange against my skin, like I wasn't even fully back in the world I knew. I called a friend to tell them what had happened, and they laughed, thinking I was just spooked by an animal. But I knew what I'd seen. I wasn't imagining things. I haven't been back to that campsite since. I don't know what it was. Maybe it was just a person out there in the woods, but something tells me I'll never know for sure. But one thing is certain. I won't ever forget the feeling of being watched, the feeling that someone was out there, waiting, and I'll never camp alone in the woods again. It was supposed to be a simple camping trip, just a few days to get away from everything, a break from the noise of everyday life and the chance to clear my head. I had no idea how quickly everything would turn into something I couldn't explain, or how dangerous it would become. I didn't think anything bad could happen. Not here, not so far away from civilization. But I was wrong. I arrived at the campsite late in the afternoon. The sun was already starting to dip behind the mountains, and the sky was filled with that golden hue that only happens at dusk. There was a chill in the air, something that made me pull my jacket a little tighter around my shoulders. The ground was damp from an earlier rain, and the smell of pine and fresh earth filled the air. The trees were tall, thick, and close together, casting long shadows over the campsite. I set up my tent near a small stream that trickled through the woods. The sound of the water was soothing, and it made the forest feel alive, almost like the place was breathing with me. The firewood I had brought with me was still dry, so I managed to get a fire started without too much trouble. The flames crackled and popped as I sat back and watched them dance. Everything was perfect, at least at first. As the sun disappeared and the sky darkened, the forest around me seemed to grow quieter. The sounds of wildlife faded into the distance, leaving only the rustle of leaves in the wind and the occasional snap of a branch somewhere deep in the woods. I figured it was just a deer or maybe a raccoon, something harmless, so I didn't pay much attention. After I ate a quick meal, I decided to go for a walk around the campsite. There was a small trail that wound through the trees, and I wanted to stretch my legs. As I walked, the shadows grew longer, the trees thicker, and the night air colder. I didn't have a flashlight with me, so I had to rely on the fading light from the campfire behind me. My footsteps were muffled by the thick layer of pine needles that covered the ground. I hadn't gone far when I noticed something odd. There was a faint rustling sound in the trees ahead of me, not like the usual sounds of animals moving, but something different. It was a rhythmic noise, almost like something was walking, but slower and heavier than anything I had heard before. I stopped, straining my ears, trying to figure out what it was. First, I thought it might be a bear, but bears don't move like that. Bears don't sneak around the way whatever it was sneaking. I felt a chill run down my spine, a feeling of being watched that I couldn't shake. I turned around and headed back to my camp, but I couldn't help glancing over my shoulder every few steps, half expecting to see something standing in the dark behind me. When I got back to my tent, I checked the fire again, adding a few more logs to keep it burning brightly. The last thing I wanted was to be out there alone in the dark with whatever it was lurking in the woods. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling as I sat by the fire. I kept telling myself that it was nothing, just my imagination playing tricks on me. After all, I had been alone in the woods plenty of times before, and nothing like this had ever happened. But then I heard it again, the rustling. It was closer this time, just on the edge of the trees where the firelight couldn't reach. It wasn't the kind of noise an animal would make either. It was slow and deliberate, like something was circling around my camp. My heart began to race. I stood up slowly, trying not to make any noise, and grabbed a stick from the fire to use as a makeshift weapon, though I had no idea what I would do with it if I had to actually use it. I waited in the dark, staring into the trees, trying to see something, anything, but the woods were silent again. I thought maybe it had just been an animal, maybe a deer or some other creature, and I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. But then came a sound I will never forget. It was the sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate, and too close. I froze, my body stiffening as I listened, every instinct screaming at me to run. But where would I go? The forest around me was vast, and I didn't know which direction would take me to safety. I couldn't just leave my stuff behind, and I wasn't about to run through the woods in the dark. The footsteps came closer, just beyond the firelight, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of it all. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel something watching me, something lurking just beyond the light. I stayed perfectly still, holding my breath, waiting for whatever it was to make itself known. Then I saw it, a shape moving through the trees. It wasn't a man and it wasn't an animal. It was something in between, something that didn't belong. I couldn't make out the details at first, but the silhouette was unmistakable. A tall, hunched figure with broad shoulders. It was walking slowly, deliberately, with each step making the ground seem to tremble beneath its feet. My mind raced. Couldn't be real. It had to be a trick of the light or my brain playing tricks on me. But no matter how hard I tried to convince myself, I knew deep down that what I was seeing wasn't a figment of my imagination. The figure moved closer, and I felt a wave of panic wash over me. I had to do something, anything, but I couldn't make myself move. I was frozen in place, staring at the thing as it came into the dim glow of the firelight. It wasn't human. It wasn't anything I could have ever imagined. I don't know how long I stood there, my mind racing and my body completely still, but eventually, the figure turned and disappeared back into the woods, fading into the shadows as quickly as it had appeared. For what felt like hours, I sat by the fire, trying to calm myself down. I couldn't stop shaking, my heart still pounding in my chest. I didn't know what I had just seen, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't safe here. Whatever it was that had been watching me wasn't going to just disappear. It was out there waiting for me to make a mistake. I had to get out. The rest of the night was a blur. I packed my things as quickly as I could, taking only what was essential and leaving the rest behind. I didn't care about the fire anymore, didn't care about the tent or the food I'd brought. All that mattered was getting out of the woods alive. I grabbed my backpack, slung it over my shoulder, and headed back down the trail, trying not to make a sound as I moved. I didn't dare look back, didn't dare stop until I was far, far away from that place. It wasn't until I reached the car, miles from the campsite, that I finally allowed myself to breathe. My hands were trembling as I unlocked the door and slid into the driver's seat. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting the world in soft, golden light. I had survived the night, but I would never forget what I had seen, what I had felt, and I knew one thing for sure: I wasn't going back to those woods. Not ever again. It was supposed to be the perfect camping trip. Just me, the wilderness, and the peace that comes with being far away from the chaos of daily life. I had picked a secluded spot by a lake, surrounded by towering pines. There was no one else for miles around. That's exactly what I wanted, a break from everything. I arrived in the late afternoon, the sun still high enough to give the forest a golden glow. The air smelled fresh, like pine needles and damp earth. I couldn't wait to set up my tent and start a fire. There was something about being out in nature, away from all the noise of the world, that made everything feel right. I found a flat area near the lake where the ground was soft but firm enough to stake my tent. The lake stretched out in front of me, calm and still. I took a deep breath, appreciating the quiet. There was nothing but the wind rustling through the trees, the occasional bird call, and the rhythmic sound of the water lapping gently against the shore. The sun was setting as I finished setting up my tent, and I gathered some wood for a fire. The sky turned shades of orange and purple as the night crept in. I lit the fire, and the flames flickered and crackled, casting shadows on the surrounding trees. I sat on a rock near the fire, enjoying the warmth and the peace of the evening. It felt like the world had slowed down just for me. But then, something felt off. It was subtle at first. I thought it was just my imagination, maybe the wind shifting or the sound of something moving through the trees. But then I heard it again, a rustling, like something brushing against the branches. I looked around, but there was nothing. The trees were still, the fire was crackling, and the night seemed as peaceful as it had been when I first arrived. I tried to ignore it, telling myself I was just being paranoid. After all, I was alone in the wilderness. Sounds like that were normal, right? I finished my meal, a simple, quick thing, by the fire and settled back to relax. But as the fire died down, the feeling of unease grew. The night had turned cold, and the forest felt much darker than it had earlier. I pulled my jacket tighter around me and looked around again. Nothing, just the trees, the lake, and the distant stars. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It wasn't until I was about to turn in for the night that I noticed something strange. My food, which I had left near the fire, was gone. Completely. I had set it down on a rock next to the fire pit, but now there was nothing. At first, I thought maybe I had moved it without realizing it, but then I noticed the odd prints in the soft dirt around the camp. They weren't human. They were large, wide, and uneven, like some kind of animal had walked through the area. I crouched down to get a better look, my heart starting to beat a little faster. The prints were fresh, the edges still sharp, and they led away from the camp, disappearing into the darkness of the forest. I stood up, my mind racing. What kind of animal would take my food? Bears, maybe, but they were usually more cautious around humans. Still, the thought of a bear roaming nearby made my skin crawl. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it toward the trees, scanning the darkness. Nothing moved. Nothing made a sound. I didn't want to stay out here any longer than I had to, but I also didn't want to panic. I decided to retreat into the tent for the night. At least in there, I'd feel a little safer. I grabbed my things and zipped myself in, lying back on the sleeping bag, trying to calm my racing thoughts. The wind outside picked up, and the trees swayed, their branches creaking as they moved. I lay there for what felt like hours, listening to the noises of the forest. The wind, the rustling of leaves, the occasional snap of a twig. Every time I heard something, my heart jumped in my chest, and I held my breath, straining to hear what it was. Eventually, I drifted off into a light sleep, but it was a restless one. Every little sound woke me up. I'd lie there for a while, listening, trying to convince myself that it was just the wind or some small animal. But the more I tried to ignore it, the worse the feeling became. In the middle of the night, I woke up to something strange, a tapping sound. It was soft at first, just a faint tapping on the side of the tent. I sat up quickly, my eyes wide, my pulse racing. It was so quiet outside that I couldn't hear anything else. Just the tapping. It came again, louder this time, as if something was gently knocking against the tent. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. It didn't make any sense. There was no one out there. There couldn't be. I told myself it was probably a branch brushing against the tent or something else harmless. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The tapping continued. It was rhythmic now, like someone or something was tapping at the tent with a finger. I reached for the flashlight and shone it toward the corner where the sound was coming from. The beam of light swept across the fabric of the tent, but there was nothing there. Nothing I could see, just the dark wilderness outside. But the tapping didn't stop, kept coming, steady and persistent. Each tap sending a wave of cold dread through my body. My mind raced, trying to come up with a logical explanation, but nothing made sense. My hands were shaking as I clutched the flashlight. I had to know what it was. Slowly, I unzipped the door of the tent and stuck my head out. The air was cold, and the night was eerily still. The fire was just a few glowing embers now, and the only sound was the rustling of the trees. I scanned the area with my flashlight, the beam sweeping over the ground, the rocks, the trees. There was nothing, and then I saw it. A dark figure standing near the edge of the trees, just outside the reach of my flashlight. It was tall, nearly as tall as the surrounding pines, and it stood perfectly still. My heart stopped. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. My mind screamed for me to run, but my body refused to move. Couldn't look away. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, like it was waiting, watching me. I wanted to scream, but the words caught in my throat. I slowly backed away, my hand still on the zipper of the tent. The figure didn't follow. It didn't make a sound. It just stood there, its shape blending into the shadows. I quickly zipped myself back inside the tent, my breath coming in short gasps. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. Had it been a person? No, it couldn't be. Who would be out here in the middle of nowhere at this time of night? My head was spinning, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The tapping had stopped, but the silence that followed was even worse. The fear was thick in the air, and I felt trapped. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure in my mind, standing motionless just outside the tent. It wasn't until the first light of dawn broke through the trees that I finally managed to calm down a little. The fear didn't disappear, but it lessened, and I slowly packed up my camp, ready to leave. I didn't want to stick around to find out what that figure had been. As I gathered my things, I kept my eyes on the surrounding trees, half expecting the figure to appear again, but it never did. I made my way back to my car as quickly as I could, my hands trembling the whole time. When I finally reached the road and saw the familiar, comforting sight of my car parked by the side, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. I drove off without looking back, my heart still racing, The image of that dark figure burned into my mind. I'll never know what it was. Maybe it was just a figment of my imagination, brought on by the isolation and fear of being alone in the dark. But the feeling that something was out there, watching me, never left. And I'll never go camping alone again, not after that night. I had always been the type of person who enjoyed the great outdoors. There's something about the quiet of the forest, the sounds of rustling leaves, the chirp of insects, and the clean, fresh air that felt so far from the noise and chaos of everyday life. After a few months of city grind, I decided to go on a solo camping trip to get away from everything. Just me, a tent, a campfire, and the wilderness. It was meant to be a peaceful retreat to clear my head. What I didn't know was that this trip would become a test of survival. I set off early in the morning, making my way into the mountains, where the hiking trails were less crowded and the air was thinner. The route I picked was a bit off the beaten path, with a small forest clearing I had found on a map. I had been there once before, but never alone. It was quiet, secluded, and the kind of place that felt like a perfect spot to set up camp. After a few hours of hiking, I reached the clearing. It was beautiful. Tall trees surrounded it, their leaves casting long shadows as the sun began to dip lower in the sky. There was a small creek running nearby, its sound calming and peaceful. I quickly set up my tent, unpacked my gear, and got a fire going. The warmth of the fire felt good against the crisp evening air, and I settled in, cooking some canned beans and a bit of jerky. As the night deepened, the forest around me grew darker. I could still hear the creek, the occasional chirp of a bird or rustle of leaves in the wind, but the sense of isolation was palpable. I was so used to city life, with the hum of traffic and distant sirens, that this kind of silence felt almost eerie, like the world was holding its breath. I sat by the fire, roasting marshmallows and trying to enjoy the moment, but there was something in the air. It was subtle at first, just a strange feeling, like being watched. It wasn't a dramatic shift, but enough to make me glance around occasionally. The feeling didn't go away. Instead, it seemed to grow stronger the longer I sat there. I shook it off, telling myself it was just my imagination. There was no one out here, just me and the forest. Around midnight, I decided it was time to turn in. I put out the fire, crawled into my sleeping bag, and zipped the tent up tightly. The wind had started picking up, rustling the leaves outside. The darkness outside seemed absolute, and the quiet felt almost oppressive now that the fire was gone. Just as I was about to drift off to sleep, I heard it, a faint sound, like footsteps in the dirt. My heart skipped a beat. I froze, listening intently. Nothing. The wind was still howling outside, and the creek continued its gentle murmur. But those footsteps, they were unmistakable. I held my breath and waited for a few moments, but the sound didn't return. I started to convince myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or something larger, but the unease still clung to me. I tried to push the thought away and shut my eyes, but sleep wouldn't come. I kept hearing those footsteps, faint but distinct, like someone walking around the perimeter of my campsite. I lay there, tense, my senses alert to every little sound. The minutes stretched on, and then, just as I began to finally drift off, a loud crack echoed through the trees, as if a branch had snapped. I shot up in my sleeping bag, heart pounding. The noise came from the direction of the creek. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent slowly, trying not to make any noise. I peered out into the darkness, but I couldn't see anything. The wind had stopped, and the night was eerily still again. The trees loomed over the clearing, their twisted branches casting long shadows. There was no movement. I debated whether or not to go investigate. On one hand, I didn't want to seem paranoid, but on the other, something felt wrong. I decided to stay put, but my mind kept racing. The footsteps, the crack, the sudden quiet, all of it added up to something that didn't sit right with me. The night dragged on in tense silence. My eyes darted around the tent, searching for any sign of movement outside, but nothing came. I finally mustered the courage to close my eyes again, trying to tell myself that I was just letting my mind run wild. The next morning, I woke up to the harsh light of the sun filtering through the trees. The forest had returned to its usual calm. I packed up my gear and decided to head out for a hike before breaking camp. The air was fresh, the birds were chirping, and the silence had a calming quality again. I tried to push the uneasy feelings from the night before out of my mind. As I hiked along the trail near the creek, I noticed something odd. There were footprints in the mud, large ones like they had been made by someone wearing boots. They weren't animal tracks. They were human. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. I bent down to get a closer look. They were fresh, as if someone had passed through just moments before. There was no one else out here, or at least that's what I thought. I felt a knot in my stomach. The tracks led down the creek and toward the edge of the clearing where I had camped. I glanced over my shoulder nervously. Was I being paranoid? Or was someone out here with me? I followed the tracks cautiously. They led me to a large tree where the ground had been disturbed, like someone had been digging or moving things around. The area around the tree seemed unusually messy, with broken branches and a few pieces of what looked like torn cloth. It didn't make any sense. This wasn't an animal's doing. I turned around quickly, my mind racing. What if someone had been watching me last night? What if they were still nearby? My instincts told me to pack up and leave immediately, but there was one problem. I didn't want to seem like a coward. The whole thing could be some strange coincidence. Maybe there was a hiker nearby, or a camper who had passed through. But the more I thought about it, the more uncomfortable I became. I started making my way back to my campsite when I noticed something else. My gear had been disturbed. The tent was exactly where I left it, but my backpack was slightly open. I had zipped it up last night and I was sure of it. I rushed over to inspect it, but nothing seemed missing. The unease in my gut grew into something more powerful: fear. I packed up quickly, my hands trembling as I shoved everything into my bag. My thoughts were scattered, and my mind kept racing back to the footsteps, the strange noise in the night, and now this. I didn't know what was happening, but I didn't want to stay here any longer to find out. The hike back to my car was one of the longest walks I had ever done. Every sound in the forest seemed amplified. Every rustling leaf made my heart jump. I kept looking over my shoulder, but there was nothing there. The tracks were gone by the time I reached the trailhead. Maybe they never existed at all. Maybe I had imagined the whole thing, but I knew deep down that something had been off. I made it to my car, shaking from adrenaline. I slammed the door shut, started the engine, and drove out of the forest, the sounds of the wilderness fading into the distance. I didn't tell anyone about what happened. It felt too crazy to explain, and besides, who would believe me? I still don't know if I was just being paranoid, or if something more sinister had happened. But one thing was for sure: I never went camping alone again. The forest might have been peaceful, but I would never forget that feeling, that sense of being watched. And I knew from that day on, I'd never look at a quiet night in the woods the same way again. I've always loved the outdoors. There's something about the raw, untamed beauty of nature that calls to me. So when I got the chance to go camping for the weekend with a group of friends, I jumped at it. We chose a secluded spot in the woods, a place far off the beaten path where no one else would disturb our peace. At least that's what we thought. The journey up was long and tiring, but the anticipation of a weekend away from everything was enough to make the hours pass quickly. We had planned to set up camp, do a bit of hiking, and spend the evenings by the fire. We all knew that we were going to have a great time, just like every other camping trip we'd done before. The forest was dense, with tall trees that stretched up high, their leaves swaying gently in the breeze. The smell of pine filled the air, and the sounds of birds chirping added to the peaceful atmosphere. As we made our way to the site, we had to clear a bit of brush, but it wasn't anything we couldn't handle. After setting up our tents and gathering firewood, we settled down to enjoy our evening. The fire crackled and popped, sending sparks flying into the air. We roasted marshmallows, talked about life, and shared stories as the sun dipped below the horizon. It was all exactly what we expected, but as the night wore on, things started to feel off. First, it was small things. A rustling sound in the bushes nearby, a faint crack of a twig breaking underfoot. But then it became more noticeable. It wasn't just the wind. The noises seemed deliberate, like something or someone was moving around in the woods, circling our camp. I tried to shrug it off as just my imagination running wild. After all, we were in the wilderness. There were animals, probably just a deer or a bear wandering around. But as the night grew darker, the sounds grew more frequent, more insistent. Every time the wind shifted, I could hear something moving through the underbrush. We all stayed close to the fire, unwilling to venture too far into the dark woods. I kept my eyes on the trees, trying to make sense of the movement I thought I saw in the shadows. But there was nothing there, just the flicker of the firelight dancing across the trunks. At some point, I began to feel like I was being watched. It was a strange sensation, like the hairs on the back of my neck were standing up, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was out there, just beyond the edge of the campfire's glow. Then we heard it, a loud crack, like a branch breaking. It was so close that it made me jump. We all went silent, staring into the darkness. The fire was the only source of light, and beyond it, there was nothing but blackness. Another crack, this time accompanied by the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate. We all froze, holding our breath. The footsteps weren't the hurried scurry of an animal. It wasn't the quick shuffle of a deer or a rabbit trying to get away from us. These steps were heavy, almost deliberate. I wasn't the only one who noticed. Everyone else had stopped talking, and all of us were wide-eyed, staring into the woods. Our eyes darted between the shadows, trying to make out any movement. But the trees were still. The footsteps stopped, but that only made the silence more oppressive. Felt like the world was holding its breath, waiting. Every little sound, every rustle of leaves or crack of a twig, felt like it was amplified, echoing through the stillness of the night. After what seemed like an eternity, I felt the urge to speak, to say something, anything, but the words stuck in my throat. It was like the air itself had thickened, and I was too afraid to make a sound. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. The forest fell back into complete silence. We all looked at each other, wide-eyed, unsure of what to do next. No one moved. No one spoke. For what felt like hours, we just sat there, staring into the dark, trying to make sense of what had just happened. It wasn't until much later, after the fire had died down to glowing embers, that we decided to call it a night. We all retreated to our tents, trying to shake the unease that had settled over us. I didn't sleep a wink that night. Every little noise outside made me jump, convinced that whatever was out there was still lurking, waiting. Morning came, and with it, the relief of daylight. We gathered around the fire once again, trying to act like everything was normal. The forest seemed peaceful in the daylight, with the sun filtering through the trees, casting dappled light on the ground. But something was different. The unease from the night before lingered, a quiet whisper in the back of my mind. As we packed up to leave, I noticed something strange near the edge of the camp. There were tracks, fresh ones, leading off into the woods. They weren't animal tracks. They were too large, too human. We followed the tracks for a while, but they eventually disappeared into the thick forest, leaving us with no answers. It was clear that someone or something had been watching us. The thought chilled me to the bone, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we had narrowly escaped something we didn't understand. We left the campsite in a hurry, the unease gnawing at us as we made our way back down the trail. The further we got from the woods, the lighter I felt, as though a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. By the time we reached the car, I felt like I could finally breathe again. Looking back, I still don't know what happened that night. Maybe it was someone else out in the woods, maybe not. But whatever it was real and it was watching us. And I'll never forget the feeling of being so small, so vulnerable, out there in the wilderness. The rest of the trip passed without incident, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd been lucky to get out of that forest unscathed. I've been on other camping trips since, but I always stay closer to the more populated areas now. And I always make sure I'm prepared for anything. Because after that weekend, I know that sometimes, in the wild, we're not alone. It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway. Just me, the tent, and the woods. A few days to unplug and get some fresh air, away from the noise of daily life. But that all changed when we got deep into the forest. I had been to these woods many times before, even camped here on my own a few months back. But something felt off this time. I couldn't quite place it. It was as if the trees were taller, the shadows darker, and the air colder than usual. I set up my tent early in the afternoon. It wasn't too cold yet, and the sky still had some daylight left. I could hear birds, the rustling of leaves, and the occasional distant sound of something moving through the woods. All things that should have made me feel safe. I had everything I needed: food, a fire starter, a flashlight, and a sleeping bag. It was a perfect setup for a peaceful night under the stars. But as the day wore on, I noticed something strange. The sounds around me started to fade. The birds stopped chirping, and the rustling of the leaves became quieter. The wind picked up a little, but even that felt different, almost like it was swirling unnaturally. I dismissed it as just my imagination, maybe the result of too many horror stories I'd read or watched recently. It's easy to start feeling paranoid when you're alone in the woods, especially when you've been in complete silence for hours. That night, I made a small fire. The crackling flames helped me feel a little more comfortable. The shadows danced on the trees around me, and the sound of the fire was the only thing keeping me company. I sat close to it, trying to get some warmth before I crawled into my sleeping bag. It felt peaceful for a while, but as the night dragged on, I noticed something odd again. A low, distant thump. It sounded like something heavy hitting the ground, but it was faint, just at the edge of my hearing. I ignored it at first, thinking it was just a fallen branch or maybe a large animal moving through the woods. But the sound came again. Thump, thump. I sat up straighter, my eyes scanning the trees around me. Nothing moved. I tried to convince myself it was an animal, maybe a bear or a deer, though I wasn't sure what would make that kind of noise. Bears were rarely this far into the forest, and the thumps were too rhythmic. After a while, it stopped, and I relaxed again. The fire was dying down, and I decided it was time to call it a night. I snuffed the fire with dirt, pulled my sleeping bag around me, and zipped up the tent. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there. The next morning, I woke up to a strange sight. The forest was silent, just like the night before. I stepped outside the tent, and that's when I saw the tracks. They were large, deep imprints in the soft earth, leading in a circle around my campsite. The tracks didn't belong to any animal I recognized. They were too large, and the shape was all wrong. They weren't bear tracks or deer hooves. They looked more like large human feet, but with strange indentations around the edges. almost as if the feet weren't quite right. I stood there for a long time, staring at the tracks. I had never seen anything like it before. My heart began to race, and the peaceful morning suddenly felt oppressive. The air felt thick, and the shadows seemed deeper than before, even though the sun was up. I decided to pack up and leave. The forest didn't feel safe anymore. As I started to break down my tent, I noticed something else. The branches above me, the ones that had been moving with the wind earlier, were now completely still.
No breeze, no rustling.
Just silence. I grabbed my things, stuffed them into my backpack, and started walking back down the trail. I had only walked for about an hour when I heard the sound again. A thump, a heavy, deliberate thump, not far behind me. It was the same sound as the night before. I stopped dead in my tracks, my breath catching in my throat. I turned slowly, but saw nothing. No animals, no people, just the quiet forest, the trees, and the faint rustling of leaves in the distance. My heart started to race, but I told myself it was nothing. Maybe a deer or even a fallen tree, though the sound didn't match either of those. But then, another thump, closer this time. My feet froze. I couldn't move. The sound was unmistakable now. Whatever it was coming closer. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, and the instinct to run surged through me. I turned and bolted down the trail, as fast as I could manage, trying to ignore the pounding of my heart and the frantic thoughts racing through my mind. The thumping sound followed me, growing louder and louder, almost in time with my own footsteps. Every few seconds, I would glance behind me, but there was nothing. Nothing but trees and the dense underbrush. The trail ahead seemed endless, and no matter how fast I ran, I felt like I wasn't getting any closer to safety. My legs were starting to ache, my breath shallow and ragged. I needed to stop to rest, but I couldn't. Whatever was behind me wasn't stopping, and I knew that if I slowed down, I might not make it out of these woods. Then, just when I thought I couldn't take another step, the thumping stopped. I froze again, not sure whether to be relieved or terrified. Was it gone? Had I outrun it? I didn't dare turn around, afraid that if I did, I would find something I didn't want to see. Minutes passed. I slowly started to calm down, my breaths returning to normal. The woods were quiet once again, the air cold but still. I dared a glance behind me, and for the first time since hearing the thumping, I could see nothing. The trail was empty. I kept walking, slower now, trying to get out of the woods. I had no idea what was behind me or if I was just being paranoid, but I wasn't taking any chances. When I finally reached the edge of the woods, the sun was low in the sky. I was exhausted, my legs sore, my heart still pounding, but I made it. I stumbled into the clearing near my car, and for the first time in hours, I allowed myself to breathe deeply. I got in my car, locked the doors, and drove off without looking back. As I drove away, I couldn't help but feel like I was being watched. But when I finally pulled onto the highway, I knew that whatever had been following me was left behind in the forest. I never went back to those woods, and every time I think about it, I remember the thumping sound and the tracks. I don't know what they were. I don't know what was following me, but I know one thing for sure. I'm not going back to find out. I had always loved the outdoors. There's something about the quiet, the air so fresh it feels like you're breathing new life into your lungs, and the scent of pine trees all around. So when I finally decided to go camping alone, I felt more excited than anything. No one else to deal with, just me and the wilderness. The weather was perfect, sunny with a slight breeze. It was mid-autumn, so the trees were starting to change color, the leaves orange and gold, giving the whole forest a golden hue. I found a spot deep in the woods, far from any crowded campsites. It was quiet, too quiet in a way, but I didn't think much of it. This was my time to escape. I set up my tent quickly, then unpacked my gear, sleeping bag, flashlight, some snacks, and a little stove for boiling water. I was ready to settle in for the night. As evening fell, the temperature dropped. The forest around me, though still silent, felt different. It was like the usual peace had turned into a stillness that made my skin crawl. I tried to shake off the feeling. After all, I was just camping alone in the woods. Nothing unusual about that. The sunset was beautiful, casting long shadows across the campsite as I started a small fire. The flickering light danced, making the trees around me seem alive in their own way. I sat there for a while, enjoying the crackle of the fire and the night air. But as the fire burned down to embers, I noticed something strange. There were no animals, no rustling of leaves or distant calls of coyotes, just silence. That didn't seem right. Normally, even at night, the forest would hum with life. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was just the time of year, the animals probably hibernating or nesting somewhere deeper in the woods. But then, just as I was about to call it a night, I heard something, a rustling in the bushes. It wasn't the typical noises of small animals moving through the leaves. This was heavier, like something bigger was moving nearby. My heart skipped a beat, and I tried to listen closer. At first, I thought it might have been a deer or some other large animal, but the sound was too deliberate, too consistent. It was as if something was circling my campsite. I grabbed the flashlight and shone it in the direction of the noise. The beam of light swept over the area, but I couldn't see anything. The bushes were still. Yet, the feeling of being watched, of something lurking just beyond the reach of my light, made my skin crawl. I sat there, frozen, unsure of what to do. My mind raced through all the possible explanations. Maybe it was a bear, maybe a mountain lion, or just a trick of the wind. But the longer I sat there, the more uncomfortable I became. The rustling didn't stop. In fact, it seemed to get closer, like whatever it was coming toward me. I stood up slowly, trying not to make a sound. My mind was telling me to stay calm, but my instincts were screaming at me to get out. I decided to gather my things and leave. It was probably nothing, but I wasn't going to wait around to find out. I reached for my backpack, but as I did, I heard something that made my blood run cold. It wasn't a rustle this time. It was a low growl, sent a chill straight down my spine. I turned, trying to locate the source, but again, I saw nothing. No animal, no movement, just the dense trees, the quiet night, and the feeling that I was no longer alone. My first instinct was to run. But where? The path I had come from was several miles back, and my phone had no service. If I ran in the wrong direction, I could easily get lost, and the last thing I wanted was to be lost out here in the dark. So instead, I grabbed my flashlight and stood completely still, waiting. Maybe, just maybe, I could hear something, get some clue as to what I was dealing with. The growl came again, but this time it was closer. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Whatever it wasn't just circling my camp. It was getting closer, and I had no idea how to protect myself. I could hear my heart pounding in my chest as I scanned the trees with the flashlight. The beam danced wildly, illuminating nothing but shadows. And then the worst thing happened. The rustling came from behind me. I spun around, and for a split second, I thought I saw a figure. A person or something humanoid, crouched low in the brush. But as soon as I blinked, it was gone. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't be sure if I had imagined it, but the sudden fear that surged through me felt all too real. I was terrified. I had to do something. I thought about packing everything up and running, but the fear of getting lost in the dark, of making myself an easy target, kept me rooted in place. Then, as I stood there, trying to make sense of what was happening, I heard something that finally pushed me into action. A voice, It was faint, muffled by the distance, but I swore I heard it. Call for help. It was desperate, the kind of cry that no one should ever hear when they're alone in the woods. I felt a surge of panic. Was someone else out here? Was someone in trouble? I couldn't just sit there, not knowing if someone was in danger. Without thinking, I grabbed my gear and started moving toward the sound. The voice seemed to come from deeper in the woods, and I followed it, the flashlight bobbing as I moved quickly through the trees. But the deeper I went, the more the air seemed to thicken, the more oppressive the atmosphere felt. It wasn't just the trees anymore. It felt like the whole forest was closing in on me. I don't know how far I went, but the voice stopped. It was silent again. The eerie stillness of the forest pressed in around me, and I realized how stupid I had been to venture this far. I stopped, listening for any sounds, but there was nothing. No growl, no voice, just the echo of my own breath. I turned around to head back to camp, but something caught my eye. It was a flash of movement, quick and sudden. I swung the flashlight in its direction, but all I saw were the trees. I stood still for a moment, unsure if I should keep going or turn around. The longer I hesitated, the more I felt the weight of something unseen, lurking just out of sight. My pulse raced. I had to get back to camp, fast. I began walking in the direction I thought I had come from, but everything looked the same. The trees, the ground, the shadows, everything was unfamiliar now. I started to panic. How had I gotten so turned around? The camp wasn't that far from here. I stopped again, trying to calm myself. The flashlight flickered, the beam weak and erratic as I struggled to keep it steady. That's when I heard something else. A snapping twig, followed by a heavy thud, like something large was moving. Slowly, I turned around, heart hammering in my chest. I was no longer alone. Whatever had been stalking me, whatever had been circling my camp, was now right behind me. I ran. No plan, no thinking, just running. The forest blurred around me as I pushed through the underbrush, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I could feel the branches scraping at my skin, the ground uneven beneath my feet, but I didn't dare stop. Not now. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I broke through the trees and stumbled into the clearing where my camp was. My tent was still standing, my fire now just smoldering ashes. I didn't even bother with my gear. I grabbed my pack, shoved it over my shoulder, and started running toward the nearest road. I didn't stop until I reached the highway. I had never really been much of a camper before. Sure, I'd done the usual hikes in the mountains around Vermont, and I had some friends who were into outdoorsy stuff. But those weekend camping trips with tents and campfires, that was something I usually watched from the sidelines. So when I finally decided to take a solo camping trip, it was kind of a big deal for me. I thought it would be a way to get away from the noise of everyday life, to clear my mind and enjoy the beauty of nature on my own. I chose a small, relatively isolated campsite deep in the woods. It was a place that locals knew about but didn't get much traffic. The kind of spot you'd need to know someone who had been there before to find. Perfect for someone like me, looking for solitude. I had done some research, mapped out the area, checked the weather forecast, and packed my gear. Tent, sleeping bag, a good knife, flashlight, and enough food for a few days. I even brought some books to read and a journal to write in, thinking I might finally get some peace of mind. When I arrived, it was late afternoon. The sun still high in the sky but starting to dip a little, casting everything in a soft, golden glow. The trail that led up to the campsite was narrow and winding, lined with dense trees and thick underbrush. The air smelled fresh, earthy, with that slight tinge of pine. I felt good about it, excited even. Setting up camp was easier than I expected. I knew the basics of pitching a tent, and soon I had everything laid out. The fire pit was already there, surrounded by stones, and the area was clear of any major debris. The smell of the forest was all around me, and I could hear birds chirping in the distance. There was a small creek nearby, its trickling water providing a peaceful background noise. By the time night fell, I had a small campfire going, the orange flames flickering and popping as I sat on a log, warming my hands. I ate a quick meal, just some granola bars and trail mix, and decided to call it a night. The woods had quieted down. The usual evening sounds of rustling leaves and distant animal calls had faded into a deep silence. But the silence wasn't peaceful. It was unsettling. It felt like the woods were holding their breath, waiting for something. I brushed it off at first. It's probably just the unfamiliarity of being out here alone. I got into my sleeping bag, zipped it up, and lay there staring at the tent ceiling, listening to the faint sounds of the wind rustling through the trees. That's when I heard it. At first, it was so faint I thought I was imagining it. A soft scraping sound, almost like something dragging across the ground. My heart skipped a beat. I sat up, trying to listen closely, straining my ears in the dark. The sound came again, a bit clearer now. Slow, methodical. It seemed to come from the direction of the trees, just beyond the clearing where my campfire had burned out. I didn't know what it was, but it made my skin crawl. Maybe it was an animal, some kind of scavenger, or perhaps a branch rubbing against another in the wind. But it didn't quite sound like that. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent just a little, peeking out. The beam cut through the darkness, shining across the trees, illuminating nothing but the usual forest shadows. I stood up, still holding the flashlight tightly, and walked a little way into the woods, moving cautiously. The scraping sound was gone now, replaced by that oppressive silence again. I figured maybe it had been nothing. Maybe I had just gotten too spooked by being alone. I turned back toward my tent, deciding it was best to just get some sleep. But as soon as I started heading back, I heard it again. This time it was closer. My heart raced as the sound of something dragging through the leaves echoed in the dark. I froze, trying to pinpoint where it was coming from. The flashlight's beam flickered slightly as I shook with nervous energy. I wanted to brush it off, to tell myself it was just a wild animal. But I couldn't. It was too deliberate, too unnerving. I hurried back to my tent, zipped it up, and lay down, my mind racing. I tried to tell myself that I was just being paranoid, that the sounds were nothing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there. Hours passed. I lay awake, staring into the darkness, listening for any sign of movement. My mind started to play tricks on me. Every rustle, every breeze that moved the trees, sounded like something creeping closer. The thought that someone else might be out there watching me made my pulse quicken. I kept my flashlight beside me, though I didn't dare turn it on again. The darkness felt like it was closing in. Sometime in the middle of the night, I finally fell into a restless sleep. The hours blurred together in a fog of half-dreams and paranoia. But I woke with a start at what sounded like a loud snap, like a twig breaking. My heart pounded in my chest, and I instinctively grabbed the flashlight again, turning it on and pointing it toward the sound. There was nothing, just shadows stretching across the forest floor and the soft rustling of leaves. I didn't want to get out of the tent, but I had to know what was going on. I needed to check the area around my camp, even if it was just to calm myself down. I decided I'd pack up and leave at first light, but I still had to know what had been making those noises. At the edge of the clearing where I had set up camp, the air smelled different now. It wasn't the fresh, clean scent of the forest. It was something else, something musty like damp earth and decay. I moved quietly, scanning the area around me, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the trees. The creek was still running, gurgling softly in the background. But there was something else now, something out of place. In the distance, near the tree line, I saw it, the faintest silhouette. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. It was hard to make out, but it looked like something, or someone, was moving through the trees, just beyond the reach of the light. I didn't wait to find out what it was. I grabbed my pack, stuffed everything into it without thinking, and started walking toward the trail. I didn't look back. The whole forest seemed to close in on me, the trees looming like dark sentinels as I made my way down the narrow trail. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made my heart race. My instincts told me to keep moving, to get out of there. I walked fast, barely stopping to catch my breath, until I came to the main trail that led out of the woods. The further I got, the lighter the air felt. It was like the weight of the forest had been pressing on me, and as I made my way back to the car, I started to feel like I could finally breathe again. By the time I reached the parking lot, the sun was beginning to rise, painting the sky with streaks of orange and pink. I could still hear the distant rustling of the trees, but it felt less oppressive now. I was no longer trapped in that thick, suffocating silence. I left the campsite behind without a second thought. The experience, though unsettling, was something I would never forget. I realized that sometimes the woods don't just hold beauty. They also hold something else, something wild and untamed. But I knew one thing for sure: I'd never go back to that particular spot again. There are some places in nature that are better left undisturbed, places where the quiet holds secrets best left alone. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, watching the forest recede behind me, and I felt an odd mix of relief and gratitude for having made it through the night. It wasn't just about getting out of there. It was about realizing that nature, in all its beauty, could also be a little too much for us to handle. I had been looking forward to this trip for months. A weekend away from the noise of the city, a chance to get out into the wilderness and recharge. I packed my gear, double-checked everything, and set off early that Friday morning, hoping to reach the campsite before it got dark. The drive was peaceful, just me and the open road, trees lining the sides, the sun breaking through the clouds here and there. I had chosen a remote camping spot, miles from any towns or large roads. The area had a reputation for being quiet, untouched. It was exactly what I was craving: isolation, serenity, and a break from everything. The only people I expected to see were a couple of hikers or maybe a few campers further down the trail. The hike to my campsite wasn't too long, maybe a couple of hours, but it was tough enough to get the blood pumping. The forest was dense with towering trees, the scent of pine thick in the air. Birds chirped above, and the soft rustle of the wind moved through the leaves. For a while, I just took it all in, breathing deeply, feeling like I could finally leave the stress of daily life behind. When I reached the clearing where I planned to set up my tent, I felt a sense of relief. It was exactly as I remembered it from the map: a small, peaceful area beside a stream, surrounded by dense trees. There was an old fire pit, probably left by previous campers. I set down my pack and started unloading my gear. Tent, sleeping bag, food, water, everything was laid out in a neat little campsite. Felt good to be away, out here on my own. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, I started a small fire. The warmth felt good, especially as the air started to cool. I cooked some food over the flames, a simple meal, nothing fancy. I ate in silence, listening to the crackling of the fire and the occasional splash of water from the stream nearby. I could feel the solitude settling around me, but it didn't feel lonely, just peaceful. But as night settled in, something shifted. The air felt colder, and the noises of the forest seemed to grow louder. The wind had picked up, rustling the branches high above, and I could hear the distant calls of some nocturnal animals. There was something unnerving about the sounds. I couldn't place it, but it wasn't the usual sounds you hear on a camping trip. I finished eating and sat there for a while, staring into the fire, trying to enjoy the moment. The peace I had been craving now felt fragile, like something was waiting just beyond my sight. I brushed it off, told myself I was being silly. After all, I was alone in the wilderness. Of course, it would feel different. I decided to get some sleep, so I headed into my tent and zipped it up, pulling my sleeping bag around me for warmth. I turned on my headlamp and scanned the interior of the tent, checking my surroundings. The shadows flickered from the fire outside, casting eerie shapes on the tent walls. It was comforting at first, but as the night grew darker, I started hearing things I couldn't explain. At first, it was just the sound of twigs snapping in the distance. It wasn't unusual, considering how many animals roamed these woods. But as the sounds came closer, I couldn't help but feel uneasy. I lay still, listening, my heart beginning to race. The rustling stopped for a moment, and all I could hear was the wind and the occasional crack of the fire outside. I chalked it up to wild animals, maybe a deer or something bigger. Still, the feeling of being watched wouldn't leave me. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it out of the tent, scanning the area. The beam flickered across the trees, illuminating the empty darkness. Nothing. But then I noticed something strange. Just at the edge of the beam, there was a shadow, a figure standing motionless. I blinked, thinking it was just my mind playing tricks in the low light, but when I looked again, it was still there. I froze. It wasn't moving, just standing. I quickly turned the flashlight off, hoping to get a better look, but the figure was gone. My heart pounded. Was I seeing things? Or was there someone else out here? I lay back down, trying to steady my breathing. The night dragged on, but the uneasy feeling refused to leave. I kept thinking I saw movement at the edge of the campsite. Shadows darting through the trees, shapes that didn't belong. Felt like something was out there, watching me. I woke up several times throughout the night, unable to shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Every small sound made my heart race. Each crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves seemed to carry a warning. But every time I checked outside, the clearing was empty. The next morning, I woke to the sound of birds calling, the sun already rising above the trees. I hadn't slept much, but the new light made everything feel less ominous. I crawled out of the tent, stretching, trying to shake off the restless night. The forest was still as beautiful as I had remembered, but something was different now. The peacefulness had shifted, replaced with an undercurrent of tension that I couldn't explain. I decided to pack up my things and head to a different part of the woods, hoping a change of scenery would ease my nerves. As I started walking, the silence of the woods felt heavier. The air was thick with it, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I found myself constantly checking behind me, scanning the trees for movement. Every rustle in the leaves, every crack in the underbrush had me on edge. It was as if the woods themselves were alive with something hidden. I tried to focus on the hike, on the beauty of the landscape around me, but my mind kept drifting back to that figure I thought I saw the night before. Was it real, or had my imagination run wild? I couldn't shake the image of it standing just outside the range of my flashlight, unmoving, watching. By mid-afternoon, I came across a small clearing with an old, abandoned cabin. It looked like it had been here for decades, the wood weathered and decaying. There was no sign of anyone having been there recently, but something about it felt off. My gut told me to move on, to turn back and find another place to camp, but something pulled me in. I walked closer, cautiously stepping up to the cabin. The door was slightly ajar, creaking in the wind. I stood in front of it for a long moment, unsure of what to do, but curiosity got the better of me, and I pushed the door open. Inside, the air was damp and musty. It smelled like mildew and old wood. I moved carefully, stepping over broken furniture and old debris. There was a fireplace in one corner, its chimney long since clogged with dirt and leaves. The walls were lined with faded wallpaper, peeling away in places. It looked like no one had lived here for years, maybe even decades. But then I saw it. A small wooden box on a shelf near the back of the cabin. It was old, with a rusty latch that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. My curiosity got the better of me again, and I reached for it. As soon as my fingers closed around the box, the air in the room seemed to shift. I felt a cold rush, like a chill running up my spine. I hesitated but opened it anyway. Inside was a small, folded piece of paper. I unfolded it, and as I read the words, a cold fear washed over me. "Leave now, before it's too late." The words were hastily written, the ink smudged in places. I stared at it for what felt like hours, the blood draining from my face. Suddenly, a loud thud from outside the cabin made me jump. My heart raced as I dropped the paper, bolting toward the door. I didn't look back. I ran. I didn't care about the backpack I left behind, the fire I had left burning, or even the cabin. All I cared about was getting out of there. My footsteps pounded the forest floor, my breath ragged as I sprinted through the trees, branches whipping at my face. The feeling of being pursued, of something closing in on me, pushed me to run faster. I didn't stop until I reached my car. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking, and threw open the door. Without a second thought, I started the engine and drove. I didn't look back. The drive home was a blur. I barely remembered it. The only thing I could think about was that cabin, the note, and the feeling that something had been watching me the whole time. I haven't been back to those woods since. I don't think I ever will. I had been looking forward to this camping trip for weeks. The weather was perfect, and I was finally going to get a break from everything: work, stress, and the chaos of daily life. I packed my gear the night before and double-checked everything. Tent, sleeping bag, food, water, flashlight, extra batteries, and a first aid kit. It wasn't a long trip, just a weekend in the mountains, but I was ready for some peace and quiet. The drive was smooth, and by the time I reached the trailhead, the sun was just beginning to dip below the horizon. I parked my car and grabbed my backpack, filled with enough supplies for the next 2 days. The air was crisp, and the scent of pine and earth filled my lungs as I started down the trail. There was a certain calmness to the woods, like everything was in its place, untouched by the outside world. I could hear birds chirping, the rustle of leaves, and the faint sound of water in the distance. Felt like the perfect escape. As I walked deeper into the forest, the light started to fade, and I knew I needed to find a place to set up camp. I had scouted the area online before coming out here, and there was a small clearing near a stream that seemed ideal. I reached it just as the last bit of daylight disappeared behind the trees, leaving only the soft glow of the moon to guide me. The clearing was as beautiful as I remembered from the pictures. The stream trickled nearby, its sound soothing in the otherwise quiet night. I quickly set up my tent, using the light of my headlamp to guide my hands as I worked. The tent went up smoothly, and soon I had my sleeping bag unrolled and everything settled. After a long day of hiking and setting up camp, I was ready for a warm meal and a good night's sleep. I boiled some water and ate a simple freeze-dried meal, then sat by the fire for a bit, enjoying the warmth. The fire crackled, the wood popping and hissing as the flames danced. The night was silent except for the occasional rustling of leaves or the distant hoot of an owl. It was peaceful, but there was something about the stillness that made me uneasy. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but I felt like I was being watched. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was just the isolation, and finished my meal. By the time I crawled into my sleeping bag, the fire had burned down to embers, and the night was quiet again. The temperature dropped quickly once the sun had fully set, and I zipped up my bag to stay warm. I lay there in the dark, listening to the sounds of the forest, trying to drift off to sleep. But sleep didn't come easily. My mind raced, and I kept hearing odd noises in the distance. Twigs snapping, something moving through the underbrush. I tried to ignore it, but the unease grew. Then I heard it, a soft rustling right outside my tent. I froze. It wasn't the wind. This was something different. My heart began to race. I strained my ears, waiting for another sound, but nothing came. I slowly reached for the flashlight by my side and turned it on. The beam flickered to life, casting long shadows inside the tent. I held my breath, staring at the door, waiting for something, anything, to move. But there was nothing, just the silence of the woods, as if nothing had happened. I sat there, frozen in place, my mind racing. Should I go outside and check? What if it was a wild animal? Bears and mountain lions were common in these parts, but they usually kept to themselves. I had read the warnings about making noise and keeping food sealed properly to avoid attracting them. But there was no sign that anything had disturbed my camp. After a few minutes, I convinced myself it was just my imagination. Maybe a branch had fallen, or a small animal had brushed against the tent. I tried to calm my nerves, telling myself there was no danger. I turned off the flashlight and settled back into my sleeping bag, trying to shake the feeling of unease that lingered. But then, it happened again. This time it was louder, a definite scraping sound against the side of the tent. My heart skipped a beat, and I grabbed the flashlight again, this time turning it on full blast. I could feel my pulse in my throat as I stared at the door of the tent, the beam of light trembling in my hand. I didn't know what was out there, but I could feel that it wasn't something small like an animal. It was too deliberate, too persistent. I listened, hoping for the sounds to stop, but they didn't. It was as if whatever was out there was circling my tent. The scraping continued, moving from one side to the other. I felt a cold chill creep up my spine. I had to know what it was. Taking a deep breath, I decided to leave the tent. I unzipped the flap slowly, trying to make as little noise as possible. My flashlight cast shaky beams on the dark forest around me, and I squinted into the shadows, trying to make out any movement. But there was nothing. The forest was still eerily quiet. No sounds of rustling leaves or distant animal calls. Just the soft gurgle of the stream and my own heavy breathing. I stepped outside, my boots crunching softly on the ground. I scanned the area around me, moving the light across the trees and the underbrush. Nothing. My mind was on high alert, my body tense, ready to react at a moment's notice. Still, there was no sign of anything unusual. No wild animals, no strange figures in the shadows. I stood there for a moment trying to reassure myself when I heard the sound again. This time it was closer. I whipped the flashlight around, and there, just at the edge of the clearing, I saw something. A large shape, dark against the backdrop of trees. My heart skipped. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a mountain lion. It was something else. Something human. I froze, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The figure was tall, its features obscured by the shadows, but it stood perfectly still, as if waiting for me to make a move. I felt my stomach twist. This wasn't an animal. This was someone out here in the middle of nowhere in the dead of night. I had no idea how long the person had been there. I felt an overwhelming sense of dread, as if the person knew I was watching them and was just waiting for me to make the next move. I was torn between wanting to run and staying still, hoping they didn't notice me. My flashlight trembled in my hand, the beam dancing in the trees, but I couldn't take my eyes off the figure. I took a step backward, my mind racing with thoughts of how to escape. Should I go back to the car? Should I hide in the woods? but the figure didn't move. It just stood there watching me. After what felt like an eternity, I slowly backed into the tent, my eyes never leaving the figure. I zipped the tent up quickly and huddled inside, my heart pounding in my chest. The air was thick with tension, and I could hear my own breath, shallow and quick. I lay there, straining my ears for any sound. But everything was silent again, like the figure had disappeared into the night. For hours, I lay awake, too terrified to sleep, too afraid to move. I kept hearing things. Footsteps, branches snapping, the sound of something, or someone, moving around my camp. But when I shined my flashlight out into the darkness, there was nothing. By the time the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I was exhausted, mentally and physically. The events of the night felt like a bad dream, but I knew they were real. The figure, the noises, the overwhelming sense of being watched. It had all happened. I wasn't sure if I had imagined some of it, but I wasn't sticking around to find out. I packed up my camp quickly, my hands shaking as I folded the tent and packed my gear. I didn't care about leaving some of the site behind. I just wanted to get out of there. As I made my way back to the trailhead, the woods felt different. Less peaceful, more oppressive, like something was lingering in the air. I couldn't shake the feeling that the person was still out there, somewhere in the woods, watching me. When I finally reached my car, I felt a sense of relief wash over me. I quickly loaded my things into the trunk and drove off, my eyes constantly scanning the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following me. But no one was there. The woods were behind me, and the strange events of the night felt like a distant memory, something that didn't quite fit into the world I knew. I never went back to that campsite, and to this day I'm not sure who or what I saw out there in the woods. But I do know this: some things are better left unexplored, and some places are best avoided.